They called it the Cowboys' curse, freezing nights that turned grown men into corpses by dawn. Yet, real cowboys had a dirty little secret that kept them alive when others perished. Why don't survival experts teach this anymore? Life as a cowboy wasn't all gunfights and saloons like the movies show us. The real challenge: sleeping outside night after night without freezing to death. While Hollywood cowboys seem to just throw themselves on the ground and wake up refreshed, actual cowboys faced a brutal reality that could kill them if they got it wrong. The open range didn't come with hotel rooms. Cowboys slept wherever darkness caught them, whether that was on rocky ground, muddy plains, or windswept hillsides. No mattresses, no heated rooms, no walls to block the wind. Just you, the stars, and whatever gear you carried on your horse. Makes sense why so many young men quit after their first cattle drive, right? Weather on the frontier was unforgiving and unpredictable. Temperatures could plummet 40 degrees between sunset and sunrise. Spring nights in Colorado might start pleasant and end with frost coating your blankets. Winter drives were even worse, with temperatures dropping well below freezing for weeks at a time. Cowboys working at higher elevations faced conditions that would challenge modern mountaineers, except they had to do it with 1800s technology. Rain turned everything miserable. A sudden downpour could soak through inadequate bedding, leaving a cowboy shivering in wet clothes until morning. The wind made everything worse, cutting through layers and stealing body heat faster than most men could replace it. Then there was snow, which veteran cowboys feared most of all. A surprise blizzard could bury a sleeping cowboy or turn a manageable cold night into a life-threatening emergency. But here's what's really wild about cowboy life. They couldn't just stay awake when conditions got bad. Cattle drives meant 12 to 16 hours in the saddle, followed by night watch duties. Exhausted men had to sleep regardless of weather. Missing sleep wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Tired cowboys made mistakes that got people killed or lost entire herds. The ground itself was an enemy. Rocky terrain meant pressure points and bruised ribs. Sandy areas seemed comfortable, until moisture seeped up from below, chilling sleeping cowboys from underneath. Grass looked inviting but often hid wet soil that soaked through blankets. Even seemingly perfect spots could turn into problems when morning dew formed or unexpected frost settled. Wild animals added another layer of concern to nighttime survival. Wolves, bears, and mountain lions roamed the same territories where cowboys made camp. A warm fire provided some protection, but maintaining heat sources all night required careful planning and teamwork. Cowboys learned quickly that staying warm and staying alive went hand in hand. The psychological challenge was just as real as the physical one. Imagine being 19 years old, hundreds of miles from home, lying on frozen ground while wind howls around you. Some cowboys cracked under the mental pressure of never being truly warm or comfortable. Letters home frequently mentioned the constant cold and how it wore down even the toughest men. Equipment failures could mean death sentences. A torn blanket or damaged bedroll left cowboys vulnerable to elements they couldn't control. Replacement gear was often impossible to find on remote trails, meaning cowboys had to make repairs with whatever materials they could scavenge. One small mistake in gear preparation could haunt someone for an entire cattle drive. Weather patterns on the Great Plains were particularly brutal. Clear skies that promised mild nights could give way to sudden storms. Cowboys learned to read cloud formations and wind shifts, but nature still surprised them regularly. The flatness of prairie country offered no natural windbreaks, meaning exposure was constant and relentless. Then there's the reality that many cowboys were just kids. Boys as young as 14 worked cattle drives, facing the same harsh conditions as grown men. They had to learn survival techniques fast or risk serious injury from exposure. Frostbite was common enough that experienced cowboys could recognize the warning signs in newcomers. What made survival even harder was the constant movement. Unlike soldiers who might establish semi-permanent camps, cowboys were always on the move. Each night meant a new location with new challenges. One night might offer some shelter near trees, the next might be completely exposed on open grassland. Adaptability wasn't just useful, it was essential. The weird part is how matter-of-fact cowboys were about these dangers. Diary entries and letters from the period mention freezing temperatures like we might complain about traffic. They developed an almost casual attitude toward conditions that would send modern people running for heated shelters. Medical help was non-existent on remote trails. Cowboys who suffered from exposure or frostbite had to rely on folk remedies and the limited knowledge of their companions. Serious cold-related injuries often meant the end of a cowboy's career, assuming they survived long enough to recover. Understanding these challenges sets up everything else about cowboy survival techniques. Without grasping how genuinely dangerous and uncomfortable their sleeping conditions were, the ingenious methods they developed might seem like overkill. But when staying warm literally meant staying alive, cowboys got creative with their solutions in ways that would impress modern survival experts. Trail bosses didn't exactly hand out itineraries with 5-star hotels marked along the route. When you're driving thousands of cattle across unmarked wilderness, you stop when the sun goes down, period. Cowboys would spend months on these drives, moving from Texas up to Kansas railheads or all the way to Montana ranges. The landscape changed constantly, rolling prairie one day, rocky canyons the next, river crossings that could turn deadly in a heartbeat. Setting up camp wasn't like pitching a tent at a modern campground. Cowboys had maybe 20 minutes of daylight left to figure out where they'd spend the next 8 hours. They'd scan for water sources, check wind direction, and hope they weren't bedding down in a flash flood zone. Sometimes luck played a bigger role than planning. A sudden thunderstorm could turn a decent campsite into a muddy nightmare faster than you could say yeehaw. The chuck wagon carried the heaviest gear, but individual cowboys traveled light. Everything had to fit on their horse or get left behind. Weight mattered when you're covering 15 to 20 miles per day through rough country. Cowboys learned to pack smart or freeze. Simple as that. Their bedrolls, clothes and personal items had to serve multiple purposes. A spare shirt doubled as extra insulation. A book could prop up your head or block wind gaps in your bedroll. Knowledge sharing happened naturally around campfires. New hands watched veteran cowboys like hawks, picking up survival tricks that might save their lives down the trail. Old-timers would mention seemingly random details, how certain grass types meant softer ground, or why sleeping with your hat brim facing east kept morning dew from dripping on your face. These weren't formal lessons, just casual comments that could mean the difference between a miserable night and decent rest. Ranch hands developed an eye for reading terrain in ways most people never consider. A slight depression in the ground might trap warmer air. A line of cottonwood trees usually meant water nearby, but also indicated where cold air would settle after midnight. Rocky outcrops could block brutal north winds or create deadly wind tunnels depending on their shape and position. Cowboys learned to read these signs quickly because making the wrong choice meant suffering until dawn. Then there's the reality of carrying everything you own on horseback for months at a time. Modern backpackers complain about 40-pound packs for weekend trips. Cowboys managed with even less space, knowing their horses' health depended on reasonable loads. They couldn't just buy replacement gear at the next town either. Most of the country they crossed had no towns at all. Breaking or losing essential equipment meant improvising with whatever materials nature provided. Weather changed without warning in open country. A pleasant afternoon could turn into a bone-chilling night with 40-degree temperature drops. Cowboys couldn't check weather apps or listen to forecasts. They watched cloud formations, felt wind shifts and made educated guesses about what the night might bring. Getting it wrong meant 8 hours of misery, assuming you survived. Shared resources became crucial for group survival. If one cowboy's bedroll got soaked crossing a river, others might share blankets or make room near the fire. These weren't acts of charity, they were practical decisions. A hypothermic cowboy couldn't do his job, which put extra burden on everyone else. Plus, you never knew when you might need similar help yourself. Natural shelters weren't always available, but smart cowboys knew how to spot them. A grove of mesquite trees might not look like much, but the thorny branches could block significant wind. Creek beds offered protection from gusts, though you had to watch for flash floods. Even large boulders created microclimates that were noticeably warmer than open ground. The trick was recognizing these opportunities quickly while there was still light to set up properly. Communication between cowboys during cold nights often meant the difference between safety and disaster. They developed signals for checking on each other without fully waking up. A whispered, "all good," might get passed down the line of bedrolls every few hours. If someone didn't respond, others would check to make sure they weren't developing hypothermia or frostbite. Cowboys also learned to read their horses for weather cues. Animals often sense temperature changes before humans do. A horse standing with its rump to the wind meant weather was coming from that direction. Cattle bunching together unusually tight indicated they were preparing for cold. Experienced trail hands paid attention to these animal behaviors as seriously as they watched the sky. The reality was beautifully simple and brutally harsh at the same time. No fancy equipment, No backup plans, no calling for rescue if things went wrong. Just men, animals, and whatever gear they could carry, facing whatever nature decided to throw at them. They had to be resourceful because there wasn't any other choice. But having the right gear made all the difference between surviving and thriving on the trail. And the most important piece of equipment any cowboy owned wasn't his gun or his saddle, it was something much simpler that literally wrapped around his entire world each night. Life on the open range was brutal, but cowboys weren't defenseless against the cold. They had one piece of gear that made the difference between a miserable night and actual survival: the bedroll. This wasn't just some fancy camping equipment, it was their portable fortress against freezing temperatures, wind, and whatever else Mother Nature threw at them. The bedroll was basically the cowboy's bedroom, closet, and survival kit, all rolled into one, literally rolled. When morning came, everything got wrapped up tight into a bundle that could be strapped to a horse or tossed onto a wagon. No assembly required, no complicated setup, just unroll, sleep, wake up, and pack it away again. But here's where it gets interesting. Every cowboy's bedroll was different. Some preferred thick wool blankets layered like a sandwich, others went for quilts their mothers or sweethearts had made back home. A few lucky ones had both. The smart ones always included a tough outer layer to keep the weather out and the warmth in. The design was simple genius. Think of it as the great-grandfather of the modern sleeping bag, except way more versatile. A typical bedroll started with a canvas tarp or heavy cloth spread on the ground. Then came the blankets, usually 2 or 3 wool ones, sometimes a quilt for extra comfort. The whole thing folded over on itself, creating a cocoon that trapped body heat. Cowboys learned fast that the devil was in the details. The outer canvas wasn't just for show, it blocked wind that could suck the warmth right out of you. Rain would roll off instead of soaking through to the blankets underneath. Even morning dew, which could leave you damp and shivering, stayed on the outside where it belonged. What made bedrolls even smarter was their dual purpose. During the day they carried a cowboy's personal belongings safely wrapped inside: spare clothes, letters from home, maybe a book or a deck of cards. Everything stayed dry and protected. When night fell, those same belongings became extra insulation and padding. The rolling technique itself was an art form. Old-timers could pack their bedrolls so tight it looked like a professional military kit. Newcomers, their bedrolls looked like they'd been attacked by a tornado, but everyone learned eventually, because a poorly packed bedroll meant wet blankets, and wet blankets meant a dangerous night. Then there's the matter of personalization. Some cowboys swore by army surplus blankets, thick, durable, and designed to keep soldiers alive in harsh conditions. Others preferred homemade quilts that reminded them of civilization. A few practical jokers even sewed pockets into their bedrolls for hiding tobacco or playing cards where other cowboys couldn't borrow them. The weight was always a consideration. Everything a cowboy owned had to earn its place, and bedrolls were no exception. Too heavy, and your horse would hate you. Too light, and you'd freeze. The experienced hands found the sweet spot, enough layers to survive a cold snap, but not so many that packing became a wrestling match every morning. Most bedrolls included what cowboys called a pillow, though it wasn't much like what you'd find in a fancy hotel. Usually it was just the cowboy's saddle, extra clothes, or boots wrapped in a shirt or bandana. Comfort was nice, but survival came first. Besides, after 14 hours in the saddle chasing cattle, most cowboys could sleep on a pile of rocks. The really clever cowboys figured out tricks that weren't written in any manual. Some sewed ties or straps into their canvas to keep everything secure on windy nights. Others created little flaps that could be pulled over their heads for extra protection. A few even built in loops for hanging the bedroll to dry after a wet night. Weather changed the bedroll game completely. Summer nights might only need one blanket, and the canvas for ground protection. Winter could require every piece of cloth a cowboy owned, plus anything he could borrow, beg, or trade for. Spring and fall were the trickiest seasons. Warm days that fooled you into packing light, then temperatures that dropped like a stone once the sun disappeared. The bedroll wasn't just equipment, it was a cowboy's mobile home. It represented security in a world where nothing else was guaranteed. Men who lost their bedrolls to river crossings or stampedes often found themselves in real trouble. Replacing one on the trail was expensive and difficult. Most cowboys guarded their bedrolls almost as carefully as their horses, but even the best bedroll was just the foundation. The canvas might keep the wind out, and the blankets might trap heat, but staying warm on a freezing night required more than just good bedding. Cowboys had to master the outer shell of their survival system, and that started with understanding why canvas became their best friend on cold nights. Cowboys knew their bedrolls were only as good as their outer shell. Enter canvas, the unsung hero of frontier survival. This wasn't your grandmother's delicate fabric. We're talking about heavy-duty, rough-as-nails canvas that could take a beating and keep on protecting. Canvas became the cowboys' portable roof, walls and weather barrier, all rolled into one. The stuff was thick enough to stop wind dead in its tracks. Rain? Canvas laughed at rain. Well, mostly, a good piece of canvas could turn a freezing night into something merely uncomfortable, which in cowboy terms was practically luxurious. But here's where it gets interesting. Not all canvas was created equal. Cowboys learned fast which types worked, and which left them shivering like leaves in a tornado. The best canvas was heavy, really heavy. Makes sense, right? Thin canvas was about as useful as a chocolate teapot when a prairie storm hit. The smart cowboys treated their canvas like a prized horse. They'd rub it down with oil or wax, working the stuff deep into the fibers. This wasn't just busy work during boring evenings around the campfire. Oil treatment made canvas nearly waterproof and added years to its life. A well-oiled piece of canvas could shed water like a duck's back. Then there's the weight factor. Canvas bedrolls weren't exactly lightweight camping gear. A good canvas outer layer could weigh 10 pounds or more when dry. Wet? Forget about it. But cowboys weren't worried about ultralight backpacking. They had horses and wagons to carry their gear, and they'd rather haul extra weight than freeze to death. Canvas also served as the cowboys' personal storage unit. The outer layer wasn't just wrapped around blankets, it became a waterproof container for precious belongings. Letters from home, a spare shirt, maybe a flask of whiskey for medicinal purposes. Everything stayed dry inside that canvas cocoon. Weather in the Old West didn't mess around. One minute you'd have clear skies, the next you'd be facing sideways rain that seemed to come from every direction at once. Canvas gave cowboys a fighting chance against nature's mood swings. The tight weave blocked wind that could steal body heat faster than a pickpocket in Dodge City. But canvas had one major weakness: fire. Cowboys had to be careful around campfires because canvas would go up in flames quicker than gossip in a small town. Many a cowboy learned this lesson the hard way, watching holes appear in their bedroll after sparks jumped from the fire. Smart cowboys kept their canvas bedrolls positioned just right, close enough to catch some heat, far enough to avoid becoming kindling. The durability of canvas was legendary among trail hands. A quality piece could last for years, surviving countless nights under the stars, being rolled and unrolled hundreds of times, dragged across rough ground, and stuffed into saddlebags. Canvas didn't pamper easily. It got better with age, like a good pair of boots or a reliable horse. Cowboys developed tricks for maximizing their canvas protection. Some would rig up their bedrolls like mini lean-tos, using stakes or rope to create an angled shelter. Others learned to wrap themselves burrito style, with the canvas forming a complete envelope around their body and blankets. The technique varied, but the goal was always the same: keep the cold and wet on the outside. Color mattered too, though not for fashion reasons. Light-colored canvas reflected heat during hot days, while darker canvas absorbed warmth from the sun. Cowboys heading into cold country often preferred darker canvas that could soak up every bit of available warmth during the day and hold onto it longer after sunset. Repairs were a constant concern. Canvas might be tough, but it wasn't indestructible. Cowboys carried needles, thread, and patches like a frontier sewing kit. A rip in your canvas outer layer could mean the difference between a decent night's sleep and 8 hours of misery. Some cowboys got so good at patching canvas they could do it by firelight with half-frozen fingers. Canvas bedrolls became personal signatures on the trail. Each cowboy knew his own bedroll by sight, even in the dim light of dawn when everything looked grey and similar. The way the canvas was folded, the particular shade it had weathered to, the pattern of patches and wear marks, these became as recognizable as faces around the campfire. The best canvas came from back east, shipped west by wagon and train, but supply wasn't always reliable on the frontier. Cowboys learned to make do with whatever canvas they could find. Sailcloth, wagon covers, even old tents got pressed into service as bedroll material when times were desperate. Canvas gave cowboys confidence to venture into harsh territory. With good canvas protection, they could sleep anywhere: rocky ground, muddy creek banks, or windswept hilltops. This mobility was crucial for cattle drives that might cover thousands of miles through unpredictable terrain. Yet canvas was just the beginning of staying warm. The real secret weapon waited inside that protective shell, ready to trap heat and save lives on the coldest nights. Canvas might have kept the wind out, but it was wool blankets that actually saved cowboys from freezing to death. These weren't your grandmother's decorative throws either. We're talking about thick, heavy wool blankets that could mean the difference between waking up or not waking up at all. Cowboys knew something that modern campers are just rediscovering: wool works even when everything goes wrong. Cotton blankets, useless once they got wet. Silk, too expensive and not warm enough. But wool, that stuff was like having a personal heating system wrapped around your body. The fibers trap air in tiny pockets, creating insulation that keeps working even when soaked through. Here's the crazy part about wool that most people don't know. When wool gets wet, it actually generates heat through a chemical reaction. The moisture causes the fibers to absorb water vapor and release energy. Cowboys didn't understand the science, but they sure understood the results. A wet wool blanket could still keep you alive on a freezing night. Most cowboys carried at least 2 wool blankets in their bedrolls. The smart ones had 3 or 4. These weren't lightweight camping blankets either. A good wool blanket weighed between 8 and 12 pounds. Heavy, absolutely, worth carrying that extra weight. Ask any cowboy who survived a blizzard in Colorado. The Hudson's Bay Company made some of the most popular blankets on the frontier. Those distinctive striped blankets weren't just for show. The colored stripes actually indicated the blanket's size and value in the fur trade. Cowboys could tell at a glance whether they were looking at a 4-point blanket or a 6-point blanket. More points meant more wool, more warmth, and more money. But here's where cowboys got creative with their wool strategy. They didn't just pile all the blankets on top. The experienced hands knew to put one blanket under their bodies and the rest on top. That bottom blanket acted like a barrier between their body heat and the cold ground. Without it, the earth would suck the warmth right out of them, no matter how many blankets they piled on top. Some cowboys swore by a technique called blanket burrito. They'd wrap themselves completely in wool, tucking the edges under their bodies to create a sealed cocoon. Looked ridiculous, worked perfectly. The key was leaving just enough opening around the face to breathe, without letting all the warm air escape. Then there were the quilts. Cowboys who had women in their lives often carried quilts made by mothers, wives, or sweethearts. These weren't just sentimental keepsakes. A well-made quilt could provide extra insulation and comfort that made those brutal nights bearable. The batting inside quilts, whether cotton or wool, added another layer of warmth when combined with blankets. The really experienced cowboys developed a sixth sense about how many blankets they'd need each night. Clear sky, 2 blankets might do. Clouds rolling in, better grab the 3rd one. Wind picking up, time for the full arsenal. They could read weather signs and adjust their bedding before the cold hit. Wool blankets had another advantage that saved lives. They didn't catch fire easily. Cowboys slept close to their campfires, sometimes with sparks flying around all night. Cotton blankets would go up in flames. Wool blankets might get singed, but they'd usually just smolder and go out. More than one cowboy woke up to find burn holes in his blanket, but his skin intact. Maintaining wool blankets on the trail was an art form. Cowboys would air them out whenever possible, shaking off dirt and letting them dry in the sun. They'd beat them with sticks to knock out dust and debris. A well-cared-for wool blanket could last for years of hard use. Neglect it, and you'd be shivering within months. The weight of wool blankets created another unexpected benefit. That heavy pressure actually helped cowboys sleep better in stressful situations. It was like having a weighted blanket decades before anyone knew about anxiety relief. The constant pressure from predators, weather, and cattle meant cowboys needed all the help they could get to actually rest. Some outfits issued standard blankets to their cowboys, but most men preferred to buy their own. A cowboy's blanket was personal. He knew exactly how it felt, how warm it kept him, and what tricks worked best with that particular wool. Breaking in someone else's blanket was like wearing someone else's boots. Quality varied wildly among wool blankets. The best ones came from mills in the eastern United States, or from England. Cheaper versions might be made from recycled wool, or mixed with other fibers. Cowboys learned to tell the difference by feel, smell, and performance. A good blanket was an investment that paid dividends every cold night. But wool blankets were just part of the equation. Smart cowboys knew that all the wool in the world wouldn't help if they didn't have something solid underneath to block the cold ground from stealing their body heat. That's where the ground cloth became absolutely critical for survival. Canvas and wool blankets were brilliant, but cowboys learned early that warmth from above meant nothing if cold crept up from below. The ground was their biggest enemy. Rocky soil, frozen earth, and damp grass could steal body heat faster than a pickpocket in a saloon. Smart trail hands knew they needed something tough between them and the unforgiving ground. Enter the ground cloth. This wasn't some fancy camping gear, it was pure necessity, wrapped in practicality. Most cowboys used heavy oilcloth, basically canvas that had been treated with linseed oil until it became waterproof. Others made do with extra pieces of canvas, leather hides, or whatever tough material they could get their hands on. The key was thickness and water resistance. Why did this matter so much? Well, the earth is a heat sink. Even on nights that felt mild, the ground temperature could drop 20 degrees lower than the air. Sleeping directly on dirt was like lying on a giant ice block that slowly drained warmth from your body all night long. Cowboys who skipped the ground cloth often woke up shivering, no matter how many blankets they piled on top. Then there's the moisture problem. Dew forms every night, especially in valleys and near water sources. Ground fog settles in low areas where cowboys often camped. Without protection underneath, that moisture soaked right through bedrolls, turning warm wool into a cold, soggy mess. Wet bedding was worse than no bedding. It actually pulled heat away from the body faster than sleeping in just clothes. But here's where cowboys got clever with their ground cloths. They didn't just throw them down anywhere. Experienced hands learned to read the terrain like a book. They avoided low spots where cold air pooled and water collected. They looked for slightly elevated areas with good drainage. Rocky patches that seemed uncomfortable actually worked better than soft grass that held moisture. The really smart cowboys carried 2 ground cloths when possible. One went under the bedroll as a barrier against cold and damp. The second could be used as a windbreak, a makeshift shelter, or even folded double for extra insulation on brutal nights. Cowboys called this doubling down, and it often meant the difference between sleep and misery. Setting up the ground cloth became an art form. Cowboys stretched it tight and secured the corners with rocks, stakes, or whatever they could find. Wrinkles and folds created cold spots where air could circulate underneath. A properly laid ground cloth formed a smooth, waterproof platform that trapped warm air and kept cold earth at bay. Oilcloth had another advantage. It was incredibly tough. Cowboys could use the same ground cloth for months or even years. It resisted tears, shrugged off sharp rocks, and actually got better with age as the oil treatment worked deeper into the fabric. Some old-timers swore their ground cloths had been with them on dozens of cattle drives across thousands of miles. Let's not forget the comfort factor. Sleeping on rocky ground without protection was like trying to rest on a bed of marbles. Even small stones felt like boulders after a few hours. A thick ground cloth smoothed out minor bumps and provided a buffer against sharp objects. Cowboys could actually get some real sleep instead of constantly shifting to avoid painful pressure points. The weird part is, how many greenhorns ignored this simple piece of gear? They'd invest in expensive blankets and fancy bedrolls, but skip the ground cloth to save weight or money. Veteran cowboys could spot these rookies immediately. They were the ones shivering and complaining about cold backs every morning. Ground cloths served double duty during the day. Cowboys used them to wrap gear, cover supplies during rain, or create shade during rest stops. Some spread them out to dry wet clothes or boots. The versatility made the extra weight worthwhile, especially on long drives where every piece of equipment had to earn its place. Weather could turn nasty fast on the open range. Rain, snow, and sleet were constant threats. A good ground cloth meant cowboys could hunker down almost anywhere and stay relatively dry underneath. Even when water ran in streams around their sleeping spot, the waterproof barrier kept them comfortable enough to rest. The really experienced hands knew tricks for maximizing ground cloth effectiveness. They'd gather dry grass or leaves to create extra insulation between the cloth and the ground. Some carried small pieces of wood or bark to place under their bedrolls for additional padding and warmth. Ground cloths also helped with morning routines. Cowboys could roll up their bedding on the waterproof surface without worrying about dew or frost making everything damp. This kept their gear in better condition and reduced the time needed to pack up camp before moving the herd. But ground protection was just one piece of the survival puzzle. Cowboys who mastered the art of staying warm from below still faced another challenge, creating enough heat to make those cold nights bearable. That's where the real magic happened around the campfire, and the tricks they used there would surprise you. Cowboys knew something most people today have forgotten: Fire wasn't just about cooking beans or boiling coffee. When you're sleeping under stars with nothing but canvas and wool between you and a bone-chilling night, that flickering campfire becomes your lifeline. Smart trail hands treated their fire like a sleeping partner, positioning everything just right to catch every bit of warmth without waking up as human barbecue. The trick started with location. Cowboys didn't just plop down anywhere and light a match. They'd study the wind, check for overhead branches, and find spots where the ground wouldn't soak up all the heat. Rocky areas worked great because stones held warmth long after the flames died down. Then came the careful dance of bedroll placement. Close enough to feel the heat on your back, far enough that a stray spark wouldn't turn your only blanket into Swiss cheese. But here's where things get interesting. Those old-timers figured out something that would make modern campers jealous. They'd heat up flat stones in the fire for hours, then wrap them in spare cloth and tuck them inside their bedrolls. Instant heating pads that stayed warm until morning. Your feet got toasty, your hands thawed out, and suddenly that frozen ground didn't feel quite so brutal. The rocks had to be completely dry though. Wet stones could explode when heated, and nobody wanted to explain that mess to the trail boss. Fire placement became an art form on cattle drives. Cowboys arranged their bedrolls in a rough circle around the fire pit, like spokes on a wagon wheel. This setup meant everyone caught some heat, but it also created a natural rotation system. The guy closest to the flames got the best spot, but he also pulled first watch duty to keep the fire going. Fair trade, right? When his shift ended, bedrolls would shift around so the next guard got the prime real estate. Then there's the question of fuel. Out on the open range, firewood wasn't exactly growing on trees, literally. Cowboys learned to burn dried cow dung, called buffalo chips or prairie coal. Sounds gross, but it burned clean and hot, perfect for overnight warmth. They'd gather armfuls during the day and pile it near the fire site. Smart hands always collected more than they thought they'd need, because nothing killed morale faster than a dead fire at 3 in the morning. Keeping that fire alive through the night required strategy. Cowboys didn't want roaring bonfires that ate through fuel and created dangerous sparks. They wanted steady, long-burning coals that radiated heat for hours. The secret was building what they called a banker fire, logs arranged so they'd burn slowly and feed each other throughout the night. One thick log on the bottom, smaller pieces arranged on top in a careful pattern. Add the right amount of airflow, and you'd wake up to glowing embers instead of cold ashes. Night watch rotations revolved around fire duty. Every 2 or 3 hours, someone would roll out of their bedroll, add fuel, and adjust the logs. Sometimes they'd bank extra coals on the side of the fire ring, insurance against the main fire dying out. The worst job was the pre-dawn shift when temperatures dropped lowest, and the fire had been burning all night. Those guys earned their coffee, trust me. Wild animals added another layer to the fire strategy. Wolves, coyotes, and mountain lions generally avoided firelight, so keeping flames visible protected both the cowboys and the cattle. But too much light could spook the herd, and sparks flying everywhere created different problems. Cowboys found the sweet spot, enough glow to keep predators nervous. Not so much that it turned their camp into a beacon for trouble. Weather made everything complicated. Rain meant protecting the fire with whatever canvas they could spare, sometimes at the cost of keeping their bedrolls completely dry. Snow required clearing ground down to bare earth and building windbreaks from rocks or saddles. Wind was the worst enemy, because it could scatter sparks, steal heat, and eat through fuel twice as fast. Smart cowboys dug shallow fire pits or built stone circles to control airflow. Some old hands swore by special tricks that sound crazy but actually worked. They'd heat water in metal cups and tuck them inside their bedrolls as personal heaters. Others would warm their boots by the fire before putting them on in the morning. Nothing worse than frozen leather when you're trying to get moving at sunrise. A few even heated sand in pans and used it like the stone trick, though rocks held heat longer. The firelight created something beyond just warmth though. After brutal days in the saddle, that circle of orange glow became the center of cowboy social life. Stories got told, songs got sung, and the day's frustrations melted away with the heat. But as dawn approached and the fire burned low, thoughts turned practical again. Getting that fire restarted in the morning could make or break the day ahead, and smart cowboys had techniques that went way beyond just striking matches. Cowboys couldn't control where darkness caught them on the trail, but they sure weren't helpless against it. Smart trail hands learned to read the landscape like a book, spotting natural features that could mean the difference between a miserable night and actual sleep. Trees became a cowboy's best friend when the wind started howling. Not just any trees, mind you. The thick, sturdy ones that could block gusts without dropping branches on your head. Cottonwoods along creek beds were perfect. They grew tall and wide, creating natural windbreaks that could cut bone-chilling prairie winds by half. Cowboys would position their bedrolls on the downwind side, close enough to benefit, but far enough away to avoid getting smacked by falling limbs. Makes sense, right? Rocky bluffs offered another lifesaver. These stone walls absorbed heat from the sun all day, then slowly released that warmth through the night. A cowboy who rolled out his bedding against a good-sized boulder could stay noticeably warmer than his buddies sleeping in the open. The trick was finding the right spot, close enough to catch the radiant heat, but positioned so cold air couldn't pool around you like water in a bathtub. Then there's the art of reading low ground. Sounds backwards, doesn't it? Most folks think higher ground means better camping, but experienced cowboys knew that gentle hollows and slight depressions could trap pockets of warmer air, especially when sheltered from wind. The key was avoiding actual valleys where cold air settled like thick molasses, turning your sleeping spot into a natural icebox. Creek beds presented a puzzle. Water meant life on the trail, but it also meant extra moisture and colder temperatures. Savvy cowboys positioned themselves within walking distance of water but never right beside it. They'd climb up the bank 20 or 30 yards, finding spots where they could still hear the water but wouldn't wake up covered in heavy dew or breathing frigid air that hugged the water's surface. Let's not forget the value of natural windscreens. Dense brush, rock formations, even small ridges could deflect the worst gusts. Cowboys learned to spot these features before the sun went down, claiming the best spots for their bedrolls while less experienced hands made camp wherever they happened to stop. A wall of sagebrush might not look like much, but it could block enough wind to add several degrees of warmth to your sleeping temperature. The weird part is how cowboys turned obstacles into advantages. That pile of boulders blocking the obvious camping spot. Perfect place to string up a tarp for extra shelter. Fallen logs scattered around. Arrange them to create a barrier against wind or rolling stones. Dead trees and large rocks became anchor points for makeshift lean-tos constructed from canvas or spare blankets. Smart trail hands also watched where cattle naturally bedded down. Cows aren't stupid. They instinctively seek sheltered spots that stay warmer and drier. If the herd consistently gathered in a particular area when temperatures dropped, that was valuable intelligence. Cowboys often set up camp nearby, benefiting from the same natural protection the cattle had discovered. When natural shelter was scarce, cowboys got creative with what they had. Saddles became instant windbreaks when propped against rocks or logs. Bedrolls could be arranged in clusters, with cowboys sleeping in a rough circle that shared body heat and blocked wind from multiple directions. Some trail hands carried lightweight tarps specifically for creating quick shelters, stringing them between trees or using rope and stakes to build simple lean-tos. Elevation changes offered another survival tool. Sleeping on a slight slope meant cold air would flow downhill past you instead of pooling around your bedroll, but the slope couldn't be too steep, or you'd spend all night sliding downhill in your sleep. Cowboys learned to find that sweet spot, angled just enough to encourage airflow without turning bedtime into a wrestling match with gravity. Reading the sky became just as important as reading the ground. Certain cloud formations meant wind direction would shift during the night, turning a perfectly sheltered spot into a wind tunnel by dawn. Experienced cowboys factored these changes into their camp selection, sometimes choosing spots that seemed less ideal at sunset but would stay protected once weather patterns shifted. The most successful trail hands developed an eye for combination shelters, spots that offered multiple types of protection. A cluster of boulders near some sturdy trees, positioned on slightly elevated ground with a rock face blocking the prevailing wind. These premium camping spots were worth walking an extra quarter mile to reach, especially when the temperature was dropping fast. Cowboys also learned from their mistakes, remembering which types of natural features fooled them. That cozy-looking grove that turned into a wind tunnel when gusts shifted direction. The rock shelter that looked perfect until morning dew soaked everything. These hard-won lessons got passed down to younger cowboys, creating a collective knowledge base about reading terrain for overnight survival. But even the best natural shelter had limitations, and cowboys knew they needed backup plans when Mother Nature wasn't cooperating. When most folks think about cowboys sleeping outdoors, they imagine tough guys who stripped down to their skivvies and rolled up in blankets. Wrong. Dead wrong. Cowboys who wanted to wake up the next morning, instead of as popsicles, slept fully dressed. More than fully dressed, actually. The golden rule on the range was simple: whatever you wore during the day stayed on at night. Your shirt? Still on. Your pants? Yep, those too. That vest you complained about all afternoon. Better keep it buttoned up tight. Cowboys learned fast that shedding clothes meant shedding heat, and heat was the difference between a rough night and a deadly one. But here's where it gets interesting. Smart cowboys didn't just sleep in their regular clothes, they added layers like they were preparing for battle against winter itself. Long underwear became the foundation of nighttime survival. These weren't the fancy silk undergarments city folks wore. We're talking thick, scratchy wool that felt like wearing a sheep. Uncomfortable during the day. Absolutely. Life-saving at night. You bet. Multiple shirts became standard practice for experienced hands. A cotton shirt close to the skin, then a wool shirt over that, then maybe a vest or jacket on top. Sounds crazy until you realize each layer trapped warm air between the fabric. Cowboys basically turned themselves into human thermoses, keeping their body heat locked in tight. Then there's the hat situation, which might surprise you. While city folks hung their hats on hooks before bed, cowboys kept those wide brims firmly planted on their heads all night long. Makes sense when you think about it. Your head loses heat faster than any other part of your body. A good hat acted like a lid on a pot, keeping all that precious warmth from floating away into the cold night air. Socks got special treatment too. The really smart cowboys carried an extra pair just for sleeping. During the day, your feet sweat into your socks, making them damp. Damp socks at night meant frozen toes by morning. So they'd peel off those wet socks by the fire, warm up their feet, then slip on dry socks before crawling into their bedrolls. Some even wore 2 pairs, thin cotton socks with thick wool socks over them. Boot strategy varied depending on just how cold it was getting. On milder nights, cowboys might use their boots as pillows, keeping the leather close so it wouldn't freeze stiff by morning. But when temperatures really dropped, those boots stayed right on their feet. Better to sleep uncomfortable than wake up unable to feel your toes. Not hot enough to burn, but warm enough to heat up their core area for the first hour of sleep. By the time the coffee cooled down, their body heat had warmed up the bedroll enough to keep going. Pack animals and supply bags became instant windbreaks when positioned right. Cowboys traveling with mules or pack horses would arrange their gear to create little wind shelters around their sleeping spots. A couple of supply bags here, a pack saddle there, and suddenly you've got a microclimate that's way more comfortable than sleeping completely exposed. The best trail bosses actually planned camp layouts with this in mind, and the weird part is how they dealt with their hats. Most people think cowboys just wore them to look tough, but those wide brims served as mini roofs when sleeping. A good hat kept dew off your face and blocked wind from hitting your head directly. Some cowboys would even stuff grass or extra cloth in their hat crown for more insulation. Your head loses more heat than any other part of your body, so keeping it covered wasn't just smart, it was survival. The breathing trick sounds crazy but actually works. Cowboys learned to breathe into their bedroll in a controlled way, creating a pocket of warm, humid air around their face and chest. Too much, and you'd make everything damp, which defeats the purpose. Too little, and you're just lying there freezing. Getting it right took practice, but veterans could create their own little tropical zone inside a bedroll even when it was freezing outside. Then there was the rotation system some crews used. Instead of everyone sleeping at once, they'd stagger their sleep so someone was always tending the fire and keeping it hot. The guy on fire duty would bank it up real good before his shift ended, making sure the next sleeper got maximum heat. This meant everyone got some warm sleep, even if it wasn't a full 8 hours. But the smartest cowboys knew that staying warm started way before bedtime. They'd scope out the camp area during daylight, looking for natural heat traps and wind protection. The right spot could mean the difference between a decent night's sleep and waking up half frozen. Of course, even with all these tricks, Mother Nature could still throw curveballs that tested every technique in the book. When rain started falling or snow began piling up, cowboys needed a whole different set of skills to keep their bedrolls and themselves from turning into ice blocks. When Mother Nature decided to dump rain or snow on sleeping cowboys, things got serious fast. We're talking about life and death serious, not just uncomfortable serious. Cowboys had learned the hard way that water was their biggest enemy when trying to stay warm. One drop of moisture in the wrong place could turn a cozy bedroll into a frozen death trap. The smart ones had figured out tricks that kept them alive when the weather turned nasty. That heavy canvas outer layer we talked about earlier. This was where it really earned its keep. Cowboys didn't just throw any old cloth over their bedrolls, they used thick, tightly woven canvas that could shed water like a duck's back. But here's the thing most people don't realize, even the best canvas wasn't completely waterproof. It was water resistant, which meant it could handle light rain or snow for a while, but a real downpour would eventually soak through. The secret was in how they rolled their bedrolls. Cowboys didn't just wrap things up loosely and hope for the best. They rolled everything tight as a drum, with the canvas wrapped around multiple times. Each fold created another barrier against moisture. The tighter the roll, the fewer places water could sneak in. Some cowboys even tied their bedrolls with leather strips every few inches, creating what looked like a giant sausage. But what happened when it was already raining when bedtime came around? Well, that's when cowboys got creative with their shelters. They'd string up that same canvas between trees or prop it up with sticks to create a makeshift lean-to. The goal wasn't to build a palace, just something that would deflect most of the rain away from where they planned to sleep. Snow presented a different challenge altogether. Rain might soak you, but snow could bury you. Cowboys learned to brush snow off their bedrolls every hour or so during heavy snowfall. Sounds simple, but imagine waking up in the middle of the night, freezing cold, just to sweep snow off your covers, then doing it again and again. The weird part is that some cowboys actually preferred light snow to rain. Snow that stayed frozen acted like extra insulation on top of their canvas. It was wet snow, the kind that melted from body heat, that caused real problems. That slush would find every tiny gap in their bedroll and turn their warm, dry space into a soggy mess. Smart cowboys carried an extra piece of oilcloth specifically for wet weather emergencies. This wasn't fancy gear, often just a piece of canvas they'd rubbed with animal fat or linseed oil until it was waterproof. When rain started falling, they'd pull this out and create an extra layer of protection. Some even slept with this oilcloth, wrapped around the outside of their regular bedroll like wearing a raincoat to bed. Here's something that might surprise you. Mice cowboys often built their fires differently when rain was coming. Instead of the usual campfire circle, they'd build what they called a reflector fire against a large rock or log. The rock would heat up and throw warmth back toward their sleeping area, while also providing some overhead protection from rain. The fire itself was built with a back wall that helped shield it from getting soaked. Wet boots and clothes created another nightmare scenario. There's nothing quite like trying to sleep warm when your feet are soaked. Cowboys would do everything possible to keep at least one pair of socks dry for sleeping. Some stuffed dry socks inside their shirts during the day, using body heat to make sure they stayed warm and moisture-free. Others kept spare socks wrapped in oilcloth at the very center of their bedroll where water was least likely to reach. When their regular clothes got soaked, cowboys faced a tough choice: sleep in wet clothes and risk hypothermia, or strip down and hope their body heat and blankets could keep them alive until morning. Most chose a middle ground. They'd keep on dry undergarments if they had them, but peel off the soaking wet outer layers. Those wet clothes would get hung near the fire if possible, or at least kept outside the bedroll where they couldn't make everything else damp. The most experienced trail hands could actually predict weather changes and prepare accordingly. They'd watch cloud formations, feel changes in wind direction, and notice how their horses or cattle were acting. When bad weather was coming, they'd find the best possible campsite and set up extra protection before the first drops fell. But even with all these precautions and tricks, some nights were just plain miserable. Cowboys would huddle in their damp bedrolls, listening to rain drumming on canvas, knowing that morning couldn't come soon enough. The lucky ones might catch a few hours of sleep between weather checks and fire tending. All this preparation and weather watching was crucial, because what happened when cowboys ignored these precautions could be downright dangerous. Frostbite and hypothermia weren't just uncomfortable, they could end a cowboy's career permanently, or worse. When you're sleeping outdoors in freezing weather, your body becomes your worst enemy. Cowboys learned this the hard way. One minute you're fine, the next minute your toes won't move, then your fingers go numb. Before you know it, you're in real trouble. Frostbite was the silent killer on cattle drives. It didn't announce itself with fanfare. Cowboys would wake up unable to feel their feet, only to discover blackened toes that would never work right again. The scary part, you couldn't always tell it was happening until it was too late. Smart cowboys developed a ritual. Every hour or so during the coldest nights, they'd wiggle their toes and flex their fingers inside their bedrolls. Sounds simple, right? But this little trick saved countless digits from turning into frozen meat. They'd rub their hands together, stamp their feet, and check their nose and ears for that telltale waxy feeling that meant trouble. Well, frostbite wasn't even the biggest threat. Hypothermia was the real monster lurking in those freezing nights. When your core body temperature drops just a few degrees, your brain starts shutting down. Cowboys called it getting the shivers, but it was way more dangerous than that innocent name suggested. The first sign was uncontrollable shaking. Your body's trying to generate heat by making your muscles work overtime. Then comes the confusion. Cowboys would start making terrible decisions, like wanting to take off their clothes because they felt hot. Weird, considering they were literally freezing to death. The brain plays tricks when it's running out of fuel. Then there's the drowsiness. Many cowboys who died from hypothermia were found looking peaceful, like they'd just decided to take a nap. That drowsiness was actually their body giving up the fight. Sleep becomes death when your core temperature drops too low. Experienced trail hands learned to spot the warning signs in their partners. Slurred speech was a dead giveaway. When a tough cowboy who'd been talking normally suddenly sounded drunk, it was time for emergency action. Stumbling around camp was another red flag. Cowboys who knew every rock and root in their sleeping area suddenly couldn't walk straight. The buddy system saved more lives than any fancy gear ever could. Cowboys paired up and agreed to check on each other throughout brutal nights. They'd wake their partner every few hours, make sure they could talk clearly, and verify all body parts were still working. Makes sense when you realize that hypothermia victims often can't recognize their own condition. Hot rocks became lifesavers during the worst cold snaps. Cowboys would heat stones in the campfire, wrap them in cloth, and stuff them into their bedrolls. These makeshift heating pads could mean the difference between keeping your core warm and sliding into hypothermia. But they had to be careful. Rocks that were too hot could burn through cloth and scar skin. Smart cowboys also learned to recognize the difference between surface cold and core cold. Your hands and feet getting chilly? That's normal. Your torso feeling cold? That's when panic should set in. The body sacrifices extremities to keep vital organs warm, so when your chest feels cold, you're already in the danger zone. Movement was medicine on freezing nights. Cowboys who stayed perfectly still in their bedrolls were more likely to develop problems. The best ones did exercises inside their blankets, isometric muscle contractions, leg raises, anything to keep blood flowing. It wasn't comfortable, but comfort wasn't the goal. Survival was. Some cowboys swore by the cowboy coffee cure. They'd keep a cup of hot coffee by their bedside and take sips throughout the night. The warmth helped from the inside out, and the caffeine kept their systems active. Plus, it gave them a reason to stay partially awake and monitor their condition. The worst cases happened during sudden weather changes. A mild evening could turn into a life-threatening freeze before dawn. Cowboys learned to prepare for the worst-case scenario, not the current conditions. Better to be too warm than too dead, as they used to say. Prevention beat treatment every single time. Once hypothermia or severe frostbite set in, there wasn't much cowboys could do with their limited resources. No hospitals, no emergency rooms, no heated ambulances, just you, your bedroll, and whatever warmth you could generate. The psychological aspect was brutal too. Fear of freezing made some cowboys paranoid about every little sensation. Was that numbness in their toe, the start of frostbite, or just normal cold? The mental stress of wondering if you'd wake up with all your parts working added another layer of misery to already difficult nights. Cowboys who survived multiple brutal winters often showed the scars: missing fingers, damaged toes, or respiratory problems from breathing freezing air night after night. But they also developed an almost supernatural ability to read weather and prepare for temperature drops that would catch others off guard. The real veterans knew that gear only got you so far. When the temperature dropped to truly dangerous levels, it came down to knowledge, preparation, and a little bit of luck. Speaking of preparation, even the toughest cowboys knew they couldn't do it alone. When you're miles from civilization with nothing but stars overhead, the chuck wagon becomes your lifeline. This rolling kitchen wasn't just about beans and coffee, it was the difference between surviving a brutal night and becoming another cautionary tale whispered around future campfires. The chuck wagon carried emergency supplies that could save a cowboy's life when his regular gear failed. Extra blankets stayed tucked away in weatherproof compartments, ready for the inevitable disaster. A torn bedroll, the cook had you covered. Soaked blankets after an unexpected downpour. There were dry ones waiting. Smart trail bosses made sure their chuck wagon carried at least 2 spare bedrolls for emergencies, because losing your sleeping gear on a cattle drive was like losing your lifeline. But here's where things get interesting. The cook, often called Cookie or Koozie, held more power than you might expect. He decided who got access to those emergency supplies. Cross the cook and you might find yourself shivering through a cold snap with nothing but your regular gear. Treat him right, and he'd let you warm up by his cooking fire long after the main campfire died down. The chuckwagon's fire pit was strategically positioned to create a wind barrier. Cowboys learned to position their bedrolls to catch the residual heat from the cooking area without getting too close to the smoke. The cook kept his fire burning longer than anyone else's, often banking coals that would smolder through most of the night. Smart cowboys figured out how to sleep just close enough to benefit from this extended warmth. Storage was another crucial advantage the chuckwagon provided. While moving cattle across rough terrain, cowboys couldn't always keep their bedrolls perfectly dry. The chuckwagon offered protected storage space where bedding could stay bone dry even during the worst weather. Some cowboys rotated their bedrolls, using one while keeping a backup stored safely in the wagon. Then there's the tool situation. Bedrolls took a beating on long drives. Canvas ripped on thorny brush. Blankets developed holes. Ties broke at the worst possible moments. The chuckwagon carried needles, thread, patches, and other repair supplies. A good cook could stitch up a torn bedroll or patch a hole in canvas that would otherwise let in deadly cold air. Hot food from the chuckwagon served a purpose beyond just filling stomachs. A bowl of steaming stew or hot beans before bedtime helped raise core body temperature, giving cowboys a head start on staying warm through the night. The cook often kept a pot of coffee simmering well into the evening, and that last cup of hot liquid could make the difference between a miserable night and a tolerable one. Some cooks went above and beyond, heating stones by their fire and wrapping them in cloth for cowboys to take to their bedrolls. These portable heaters could keep feet warm for hours. The cook's fire burned hotter and longer than individual campfires, making it perfect for this kind of heat preparation. Weather prediction often fell to the cook, who spent more time watching the sky and feeling the wind than anyone else. When a cold snap was coming, experienced cooks would warn the cowboys early, giving them time to prepare extra insulation or find better shelter. The cook might even suggest moving the entire camp to a more protected location. The social aspect mattered too. The area around the chuckwagon became the evening gathering spot where cowboys shared warmth, stories, and survival tips. Newer hands learned crucial cold weather tricks from veterans during these informal sessions. Knowledge passed down around the chuckwagon fire probably saved more lives than any single piece of equipment. Water was another lifesaver the chuckwagon provided. Hot water for washing helped prevent frostbite and kept minor cuts from becoming infected in cold weather. Some cowboys used hot water to warm their bedrolls before climbing in. The cook controlled the hot water supply, making him even more valuable during harsh conditions. Emergency medical care often started at the chuckwagon. Cooks carried basic medical supplies and knew how to treat frostbite, hypothermia, and other cold-related injuries. When a cowboy's feet went numb or his hands turned white, the chuckwagon became a mobile field hospital. The weird part is how the chuckwagon created its own microclimate. The combination of the large fire, the wagon body blocking wind, and multiple people gathering in one area actually raised the local temperature by several degrees. Cowboys sleeping near the chuckwagon often fared better than those who bedded down farther away. But the chuckwagon had limitations too. It couldn't follow cattle into every canyon or cross every river. When the terrain got too rough, cowboys found themselves separated from their mobile lifeline, forced to rely entirely on their personal gear and survival skills. Those were the nights that truly tested what you'd learned about staying warm without any backup plan. Cowboys didn't just grab their bedrolls and call it a night. These guys were basically living out of what they could carry, which meant every inch of space in that canvas bundle had to count. Your bedroll wasn't just for sleeping, it was your mobile storage unit, your security system, and sometimes your lifeline. Most cowboys stuffed their bedrolls with whatever they couldn't afford to lose. Clean socks were gold out there. Seriously, having dry socks to change into before crawling into your bedroll could mean the difference between a decent night's sleep and waking up with frostbitten toes. Smart cowboys always kept at least one pair tucked deep inside their bedding, wrapped in oilcloth or an old shirt to stay bone dry. Then there were the personal treasures. Letters from sweethearts back home, maybe a worn photograph of family, or a small Bible that had seen better days. These weren't just sentimental keepsakes, they were psychological armor against the brutal loneliness of trail life. When you're staring up at a sky full of stars with nothing but cattle for company, having something that connects you to civilization can keep your mind from going to dark places. But here's where it gets interesting. Cowboys also slept with their weapons. A Colt .45 or Winchester rifle wasn't just protection from rustlers or wild animals, it was money. Losing your gun on the frontier was like losing your wallet, your insurance policy, and your job security all at once. Most cowboys wrapped their firearms in oiled cloth and kept them pressed against their bodies inside the bedroll. Body heat helped prevent the metal from freezing, and quick access could save your life if trouble came calling in the middle of the night. Let's not forget the practical stuff that kept these guys from falling apart. A small tin of animal fat or petroleum jelly for chapped hands and lips, a razor, and maybe some soap wrapped in wax paper. Basic dental care meant a small brush or just a rag for scrubbing teeth. Sounds primitive? Well, going weeks without any personal hygiene wasn't just uncomfortable. It could lead to infections that might kill you. Some cowboys carried what they called comfort items that doubled as survival gear. A small harmonica took up almost no space, but could boost morale around the campfire and help pass those endless cold hours. Playing music also served a practical purpose. It could calm spooked cattle during storms. A deck of cards weighed nothing but provided entertainment and gambling opportunities when you hit town. The weird part is how many cowboys slept with their boots. Not wearing them. That would be miserable, but using them as pillows or keeping them inside the bedroll to prevent freezing. Frozen leather boots in the morning weren't just uncomfortable, they could be dangerous. Try mounting a horse or chasing down a steer when you can't feel your feet properly. Books were another surprising bedroll resident. Yeah, these rough and tumble cowboys often carried reading material. Dime novels, poetry collections, or technical manuals about cattle and horses. Reading by firelight was one of the few intellectual escapes available, and knowledge about livestock could literally pay the bills. A cowboy who understood animal behavior was worth more than one who could only rope and ride. Money presented its own storage challenge. Paper bills got soggy and fell apart. Coins were heavy and made noise. Most experienced cowboys converted their pay to small valuable items when possible. Maybe a good knife, a quality watch, or even gold pieces that could be sewn into clothing or hidden in specially made pockets inside the bedroll. Medical supplies were crucial bedroll contents too. A small bottle of whiskey wasn't just for drinking. It worked as antiseptic for cuts and helped numb pain from injuries. Bandages made from torn shirts, a needle and thread for emergency surgery on both gear and flesh, and maybe some laudanum if you could afford it. Cowboys had to be their own doctors most of the time. Here's something most people don't realize. Cowboys often slept with tomorrow's clothes. In brutal cold, having warm, dry clothing to put on in the morning could prevent hypothermia. They'd strip off the day's sweaty, dirty gear and stuff it at the foot of the bedroll to dry out, while keeping fresh long underwear and a clean shirt against their bodies for morning. The smartest cowboys also kept emergency food in their bedrolls. Hardtack biscuits, jerky, maybe a small bag of coffee beans. Getting separated from the chuck wagon or having supplies run low wasn't uncommon, and having a few days' worth of food literally under your pillow could mean survival. All this gear management required serious organization skills. Everything had its place, wrapped and positioned just right to maximize warmth, accessibility, and protection from the elements. Veterans could pack and unpack their entire mobile bedroom in minutes, even in the dark. But what happened when Mother Nature really wanted to test a cowboy's resolve? When rain turned to ice and wind threatened to freeze exposed skin solid, even the best packed bedroll needed backup strategies. When you're sleeping on frozen ground with nothing but canvas between you and a blizzard, food becomes more than just fuel, it becomes your internal furnace. Cowboys discovered early on that what they ate before bedtime could mean the difference between waking up refreshed or waking up as a human popsicle. Hot stews packed with beans and beef weren't just delicious after a long day in the saddle, they were strategic weapons against the cold. The thick, hearty broth warmed cowboys from the inside out, creating a core heat that lasted hours into the night. Smart trail cooks loaded these stews with fat from beef or bacon drippings because fat burns slowly in your body, like a steady campfire. One bowl of properly made cowboy stew could keep a man's internal temperature stable for 6 to 8 hours. Coffee played an even bigger role than most people realize. Cowboys didn't just drink it around the campfire for the caffeine kick. They'd pour themselves an extra cup right before crawling into their bedrolls, sipping it slowly as they settled in for the night. The hot liquid raised their core temperature immediately, and the caffeine helped keep blood flowing to their extremities. Some old-timers swore by keeping a tin cup of coffee inside their bedroll, wrapped in cloth to prevent spills. But here's where things get really clever. Cowboys learned to time their eating perfectly. A big meal too close to bedtime meant their body would spend energy on digestion instead of generating heat. Too early, and they'd burn through all that fuel before the coldest part of the night hit. The sweet spot, about an hour before rolling up in their blankets. Trail cooks became masters at keeping food warm throughout the evening. They'd bury pots of beans or stew in the coals around the fire's edge, where they'd stay hot but not burn. Cowboys could grab a warm bowl whenever they needed it, even if they were pulling night watch with the cattle. Some cooks wrapped hot biscuits in cloth and tucked them near the fire, creating portable hand warmers that doubled as midnight snacks. The really experienced cowboys carried their own secret weapons. Jerky might seem like cold, tough meat, but it was actually perfect for generating body heat. Your body works hard to digest tough proteins, and that process creates internal warmth. Plus, jerky was salty, and salt helped their bodies retain the heat from their evening meal. Many cowboys stuffed strips of jerky in their shirt pockets before bed, chewing on it slowly if they woke up cold during the night. Then there's the liquor factor, though it's not what you might expect. While a shot of whiskey might make a cowboy feel warmer initially, smart trail hands knew it actually made them lose heat faster. Alcohol opens up blood vessels near the skin, which feels warm but actually lets precious body heat escape. The really cold weather veterans saved their drinking for when they were already safely bundled up and settled for the night. Leftover bacon grease became liquid gold on cold nights. Cowboys would mix it into their coffee, or spread it on hardtack biscuits right before bed. Pure fat was like putting logs on their internal fire. It burned slow and steady all night long. Some trail cooks even saved beef tallow specifically for the coldest nights, heating it up and mixing it with whatever food was available. Hot stones weren't just for warming bedrolls. Cowboys heated smooth river rocks in the fire, then wrapped them in cloth and held them while eating their final meal of the day. The warmth from the stones helped their hands stay flexible for eating, and the heat transferred through their palms into their core body temperature. Smart cooks also knew that certain spices could help fight the cold. Chili peppers, when they could get them, made cowboys sweat even in freezing weather, and that internal heat generation lasted for hours. Black pepper had a similar effect, warming the body from within. Trail cooks who knew their business always kept these spices handy for the coldest nights. Water played a crucial role too, though not in the way you'd think. Dehydration made cowboys feel colder because their blood couldn't circulate properly, but drinking too much water meant waking up multiple times to relieve themselves, losing precious body heat every time they left their bedrolls. The trick was drinking just enough warm liquid with dinner to stay hydrated without overdoing it. The weirdest trick, some cowboys ate raw onions before bed. Sounds crazy, but onions contain sulfur compounds that boost circulation and help generate body heat. Plus, the strong taste and smell supposedly kept wild animals away, though that might have been more wishful thinking than fact. Every meal decision mattered when your bedroom was the open range. These weren't just hungry men grabbing whatever was available. They were tactical eaters, using food as medicine against the brutal cold that could literally kill them in their sleep. Speaking of tactical decisions, where cowboys chose to set up camp made just as much difference as what they ate for dinner. After weeks of sleeping on frozen ground with nothing but canvas and wool between you and the bitter cold, imagine the pure luxury of finding a real roof over your head. Tonkhouses on ranches offered cowboys a rare break from the relentless outdoor nights that could literally freeze a man solid. These weren't fancy accommodations by any stretch. Most bunkhouses were simple wooden structures, roughly built and designed for function over comfort. The walls might have gaps that let in wind, and the floors were often just bare boards that creaked with every movement. But compared to sleeping under stars with coyotes howling in the distance, these buildings felt like palaces. The typical bunkhouse packed men together like sardines in a can. Wooden bunks lined the walls, sometimes stacked 2 or 3 high depending on how many hands the ranch employed. Privacy, that was a foreign concept. You'd be sleeping inches away from someone who might snore like a freight train or talk in his sleep about lost loves back home. But here's the thing about shared spaces, they generated heat. All those bodies in one room meant the temperature stayed warmer than any solo bedroll could manage. Cowboys still used their same heavy blankets and bedrolls on top of the wooden bunks, but now they weren't fighting a losing battle against the ground sucking away their warmth. Most bunkhouses featured a central stove, and this became the heart of nighttime comfort. Made of iron and fed with wood or coal, these stoves could turn a freezing room into a cozy haven. Cowboys would gather around them before bed, drying wet socks and boots while sharing stories or playing cards. The heat radiated outward, reaching even the furthest bunks with blessed warmth. Then there's the matter of fuel. Keeping that stove burning all night required planning and teamwork. Cowboys took turns feeding wood into the fire, ensuring it never died completely. Nobody wanted to wake up to a cold room when the temperature outside dropped below freezing. Smart ranch hands would bank the coals before sleep, covering them with ash so they'd smolder slowly until morning. Wooden bunks offered something else that ground sleeping couldn't: elevation. Being raised off the floor meant escaping the coldest air, which always settled at ground level. Even a few inches of height made a noticeable difference in temperature. Cowboys would stuff their bedrolls with the same personal items they carried on the trail, but now they didn't have to worry about rocks poking through or moisture seeping up from below. The weird part is how much cowboys complained about bunkhouse life despite its obvious advantages. Sure, it was warmer and safer, but it also meant dealing with other people's habits. Someone always snored too loud, another guy's feet smelled terrible, and there was usually one fellow who insisted on reading aloud from letters or newspapers. Privacy became a luxury more precious than warmth. Storage was another bunkhouse advantage often overlooked. Cowboys could hang their gear on wall pegs, keeping clothes and equipment dry and organized. No more stuffing everything into bedrolls or worrying about morning dew soaking through canvas. Boots could dry properly by the stove instead of freezing solid overnight. But bunkhouses came with their own survival challenges. Fire was always a deadly risk with wooden buildings, dry bedding and a hot stove burning all night. Cowboys developed strict rules about ash disposal and stove maintenance. One careless spark could turn a warm refuge into a death trap within minutes. Disease spread faster in close quarters too. If one cowboy caught pneumonia or fever, it could sweep through the entire bunkhouse like wildfire. Ventilation was poor in most buildings, and cowboys weren't exactly known for their hygiene practices after weeks on the trail. The warmth that saved them from freezing could also become a breeding ground for illness. Ranch owners knew that providing decent bunkhouses helped keep good workers around longer. Cowboys who didn't have to fight for survival every single night were more productive during the day. Makes sense, right? Well-rested men could handle cattle better, and were less likely to make dangerous mistakes. Some ranches got creative with bunkhouse heating. They'd run stovepipes through multiple rooms or use shared walls to spread warmth between buildings. The smartest setups placed bunkhouses near other heated structures like blacksmith shops or main houses, taking advantage of any available warmth. Cowboys often customized their bunk areas just like they personalized their bedrolls. A lucky photograph, a carved wooden trinket, or a favorite book might claim the small shelf space near their bed. These tiny touches of home helped combat the loneliness that came with the territory. Despite the advantages, bunkhouses weren't always available on the open range. Long cattle drives still meant weeks of outdoor sleeping, regardless of how comfortable the destination might be. Cowboys couldn't count on finding shelter, so they never abandoned their tried-and-true bedroll techniques. The transition from bunkhouse back to outdoor sleeping could be brutal. After several warm nights with a roof overhead, that first night back under the stars hit twice as hard. But this taste of comfort also revealed just how much the outdoor survival methods really mattered. When the weather turned deadly, cowboys had to think fast or freeze to death. We're talking about those bone-chilling cold snaps that could kill a man in one night if he wasn't prepared. These weren't just uncomfortable camping trips. These were life-or-death survival situations that separated the smart cowboys from the ones who never made it home. Old Pete Martinez used to tell a story about a blizzard in Wyoming that hit so fast, nobody saw it coming. One minute the sky was clear, the next minute the world disappeared in white. The wind was howling like a banshee, and the temperature dropped 30 degrees in an hour. Pete and 3 other cowboys were caught in the middle of nowhere with about 200 head of cattle. They couldn't see their hands in front of their faces, let alone find proper shelter. What did they do? They got creative real quick. Pete grabbed his hat and started stuffing it with prairie grass and small branches. Sounds crazy, right? But that makeshift windbreak probably saved his life. He wedged it between 2 rocks and crawled behind it with his bedroll. The other cowboys followed his lead, using their hats, extra shirts, anything they could find to build tiny barriers against that killer wind. The weird part is how they kept each other alive through teamwork. They tied their rope around their waists and connected themselves so nobody would get lost in the whiteout. Every few hours, one man would crawl from windbreak to windbreak, checking on the others. They shared body heat, took turns staying awake to keep watch, and even passed around hot stones they heated with small fires made from dried cattle dung. Then there's the story of Black Jake Sullivan, who lost his entire bedroll when his horse spooked during a sudden snowstorm in Montana. Most cowboys would have been dead men walking at that point. But Jake was tougher than a $2 steak and twice as smart. He killed a rattlesnake he found trying to stay warm under a rock, skinned it, and used the hide as extra insulation inside his jacket. He also dug himself a shallow pit and lined it with his extra clothes, creating a makeshift sleeping hole that trapped his body heat. Makes sense when you think about it. Animals do the same thing when winter hits hard. Jake survived 3 nights like that until the storm passed and he could rejoin his outfit. The other cowboys found him half frozen but alive, still clutching that snake skin like it was made of gold. But why did some cowboys survive these death traps while others didn't? Experience played a huge part, sure, but teamwork made the real difference between living and dying. Cowboys learned to watch out for each other during the worst weather. They'd check on sleeping partners every few hours, looking for signs of frostbite or hypothermia. Blue lips, confusion, violent shivering that suddenly stops. These were warning signs that meant immediate action. During one particularly brutal cattle drive through Colorado, an entire crew of 8 cowboys survived a week-long cold snap by rotating duties. 2 men would stay awake at all times, keeping the fire going and checking on the sleeping cowboys. They'd wake up their partners every 2 hours to make sure nobody was slipping into hypothermia. Nobody got more than 2 hours of sleep at a time, but everybody lived to tell about it. Well, not every story had a happy ending. Old-timers remembered drives where good men just vanished in the night. Sometimes they'd find a cowboy in the morning, frozen solid in his bedroll because he was too proud to ask for help or share warmth with another man. The frontier was no place for foolish pride when Jack Frost came calling. Cowboys also learned to read the warning signs of killer weather. Cattle would bunch together and get restless hours before a bad storm hit. Birds would disappear. The wind would shift and carry a different smell. Smart cowboys paid attention to these natural weather reports and prepared accordingly. They'd gather extra firewood, move the camp to better shelter, and make sure everyone had their warmest gear ready. And the weird part is how some of the most dangerous cold snaps created the strongest friendships. Men who survived brutal nights together formed bonds that lasted lifetimes. They'd share stories about those freezing adventures for decades, usually getting more dramatic with each telling. But underneath all that tall tale bragging was real respect for the men who helped them survive nature's worst. These survival stories weren't just campfire entertainment. They were teaching tools that passed down life-saving knowledge from experienced cowboys to greenhorns. Every frozen finger, every close call with hypothermia, every clever trick that worked became part of the collective wisdom that kept future cowboys alive. The cowboys who survived these deadly cold snaps didn't just rely on their gear. They relied on each other, their wits and their willingness to do whatever it took to see another sunrise. But surviving the cold was only part of the battle. Keeping their spirits up during those long, brutal nights required different strategies altogether. After spending hours battling freezing wind and trying to get comfortable on frozen ground, cowboys needed something to keep their minds off the misery. Cold has a way of making everything feel worse. Your muscles ache more, time crawls slower, and every small discomfort becomes magnified. But the smart trail hands discovered that fighting the cold wasn't just about wool blankets and hot coffee. Sometimes the best warmth came from something you couldn't roll up in a bedroll. Laughter was free, and it worked better than any medicine. When the temperature dropped and everyone was shivering around a crackling fire, someone would always start telling stories. These weren't just any stories, they were the kind that made grown men laugh until their sides hurt. Tales about greenhorn cowboys who tried to milk bulls, or the time someone's horse ran off with his pants. The funnier the story, the less everyone thought about their frozen toes. Music played a huge role too. Cowboys who could carry a tune often brought along harmonicas or small guitars. These instruments were lightweight enough to pack with their gear, and they provided hours of entertainment. Singing together created this weird kind of shared warmth that had nothing to do with body temperature. Well, maybe it did help a little. Singing gets your blood moving and your lungs working harder. Plus, when 20 guys are belting out "Oh Susanna" around a campfire, you forget that your fingers are numb. Card games were another lifesaver during those long cold nights. Poker was popular, but cowboys also played simpler games that didn't require much light. They'd huddle close together around a small lantern, and suddenly everyone was focused on their cards instead of the wind howling outside. The competitive spirit got their minds racing and their blood pumping. Winners might earn a few coins or an extra cup of coffee, but everyone won by staying distracted from the cold. Then there was the bottle. Most trail crews had someone who carried whiskey or some other strong drink. Now, alcohol doesn't actually warm you up. That's a dangerous myth that can get people killed in extreme cold. But a small sip shared among friends did wonders for morale. It loosened tongues, made the stories funnier, and gave everyone something to look forward to after a brutal day in the saddle. The key word here is small. Smart cowboys knew that getting drunk in freezing weather was a recipe for disaster. Cowboys also found creative ways to pass time that kept their hands and minds busy. Some carved wood, others mended gear or cleaned their guns. These activities served double duty. They kept fingers moving to prevent frostbite, and they gave men something productive to focus on. A cowboy with busy hands and a busy mind didn't dwell on how miserable he felt. Storytelling competitions became legendary on some cattle drives. Cowboys would try to top each other with increasingly wild tales about their adventures. The stories got bigger and more ridiculous as the night wore on. Did that rattlesnake really measure 12 feet long? Probably not. But when you're huddled under a blanket listening to someone spin a yarn about wrestling a bear, the details don't matter as much as the entertainment. Practical jokes also helped lighten the mood, though they had to be carefully chosen. Nobody wanted to mess with someone's bedroll or gear when survival was on the line, but harmless pranks like putting a small rock in someone's boot or short-sheeting their blanket could get everyone laughing. The victims usually laughed too because they knew they'd get their revenge soon enough. Some cowboys brought books, letters from home or newspapers to read aloud by firelight. Literacy wasn't universal among trail hands, so the guys who could read well often became the evening's entertainment. They'd share news from back east, read adventure stories, or pass around letters that painted pictures of home. These quiet moments balanced out the louder fun and gave everyone something deeper to think about. The weird part is how much these simple activities improved everyone's chances of survival. Cowboys who maintained good spirits were more likely to look out for each other. They shared blankets more readily, took turns tending the fire, and watched for signs of frostbite in their companions. A crew that laughed together stayed alive together, but keeping spirits up wasn't always easy. Some nights were just too cold, too windy, or too miserable for jokes and songs. During blizzards or when men were genuinely afraid for their lives, the mood could turn dark quickly. Experienced trail bosses knew when to push for entertainment and when to let everyone focus on pure survival. Reading the group's morale became as important as reading the weather. These moments of shared warmth and laughter created bonds that lasted long after the cattle drives ended. Cowboys would meet up years later in saloons or around ranch fires, and they'd still be telling the same stories that once kept them from freezing. Those cold nights under the stars weren't just about surviving. They were about discovering what really kept a man going when everything else tried to break him down. But even the best jokes and songs couldn't solve every problem that came with sleeping rough in harsh conditions. Life on the trail wasn't just about dodging bullets or wrestling cattle. The real enemy, your own body breaking down from sleeping on frozen ground night after night. Cowboys might have looked tough in their leather chaps and wide-brimmed hats, but underneath that rugged exterior, many were fighting a losing battle against exhaustion, illness, and the kind of bone-deep fatigue that comes from never getting a decent night's sleep. Most trail hands were young men in their teens and 20s. Their bodies could take a beating better than older folks, sure, but even the strongest 20-year-old starts falling apart when he's been sleeping on rocks in sub-freezing temperatures for weeks on end. Sleep deprivation became a serious problem on long cattle drives. When you're functioning on 3 hours of broken sleep because you kept waking up shivering, your judgment gets cloudy fast. Cowboys developed what we'd probably call chronic fatigue today. They'd stumble through their daily routines like zombies, relying on black coffee and sheer willpower to stay upright in the saddle. The lucky ones caught catnaps during the day when the herd was moving slow and steady. But those moments were rare, and real rest seemed like a luxury from another world. Then there's the skin problems nobody talks about in the movies. Constant exposure to wind, cold, and moisture wreaked havoc on a cowboy's hands and face. Chapped lips weren't just uncomfortable, they'd crack and bleed, making it painful to eat or drink. Some smart cowboys carried small tins of animal fat or beeswax to rub on exposed skin before bedtime. Others made do with whatever grease they could scrape from the cook's pans. Frostbite was always lurking around the edges of camp on cold nights. Toes and fingers went numb first, and many cowboys learned to wiggle them constantly inside their boots and gloves. The unlucky ones who ignored the warning signs sometimes lost digits to the cold. A cowboy with missing fingers or toes wasn't much use on the trail, which meant the end of his working days. Wet clothes spelled disaster for respiratory health. When a cowboy's gear got soaked from rain or snow, and he had no choice but to sleep in damp clothing, pneumonia wasn't far behind. Lung infections spread quickly through camps where men were already weakened by cold and exhaustion. The sound of coughing around the campfire became as common as the crackle of burning wood. Some cowboys developed what they called trail back, chronic pain from sleeping on uneven ground for months at a time. Rocks, roots, and hard-packed earth didn't make for supportive sleeping surfaces. Men would wake up each morning groaning and stretching, trying to work out the kinks before climbing back into the saddle. A few carried extra clothing to stuff under their hips or shoulders, but most just gritted their teeth and endured it. The weird part is how injuries seem to heal slower on the trail. A cut that should have closed up in a week might stay open for a month. Poor nutrition, constant cold, and lack of proper rest all conspired against the body's natural healing processes. Cowboys learned to be extra careful with knives and tools because even minor wounds could become serious problems. Let's not forget the toll on mental health, though cowboys wouldn't have called it that. Constant discomfort and sleep deprivation made men irritable and short-tempered. Fights broke out over trivial things: who was hogging the best spot near the fire, or whose turn it was to tend the flames. The isolation and harsh conditions wore on everyone's nerves. Smart cowboys developed their own folk remedies for common ailments. Willow bark tea helped with aches and pains. Hot stones wrapped in cloth eased sore muscles when tucked into bedrolls. Some swore by rubbing whiskey on chapped skin, though drinking it probably provided more immediate comfort. The ones who survived multiple seasons learned to read their own bodies like weather signs. They could tell when they were pushing too hard, when they needed to force down more food, or when a cough was turning into something more serious. This body awareness became just as important as knowing how to rope cattle or read trail markers. But here's what kept most cowboys going despite the physical toll: they were surprisingly good at looking out for each other. Trail partners checked each other's extremities for signs of frostbite. They shared remedies and took turns staying awake to keep fires burning. When one man was too sick to work, others covered his duties without complaint. The hardiest cowboys developed an almost supernatural ability to function on minimal sleep and maximum discomfort. They'd joke that they could sleep standing up or catch rest while riding. But even these iron-tough men paid a price for years of sleeping rough under the stars. And speaking of learning to adapt, the smartest trail hands didn't just endure. They studied what worked and what didn't. You know what separates a seasoned cowboy from a greenhorn who might not make it through his first winter on the trail? Experience. Hard-earned, painful, sometimes life-threatening experience that came from making mistakes when the stakes were brutally high. New cowboys learned fast. They had to. Their first night sleeping rough usually taught them more about survival than any ranch foreman's lecture ever could. Take young Billy Henderson, who joined a cattle drive in 1882 with nothing but enthusiasm and a thin cotton blanket. He woke up the next morning shivering so hard he could barely saddle his horse. The older hands found him curled up like a frozen armadillo, his lips blue and his fingers too numb to work the reins. That same Billy became one of the smartest trail hands in Texas within 2 seasons. How? He paid attention to every mistake and fixed it fast. Forgotten bedrolls were perhaps the costliest error a cowboy could make. Picture this scenario. You're exhausted after a long day in the saddle. The chuck wagon's already moved ahead, and you realize your bedroll is strapped to a pack horse that wandered off. Most cowboys learned this lesson exactly once. The lucky ones borrowed blankets and survived a miserable night. The unlucky ones, well, frontier graveyards tell that story. Smart cowboys developed systems. They tied their bedrolls to their own saddles, not communal pack animals. They double-checked their gear before mounting up each morning. Simple habits, but they meant the difference between warmth and a potentially deadly night. Then there was the camp selection disaster that every greenhorn seemed destined to repeat. New hands would pick spots that looked perfectly fine during daylight, maybe a nice flat area near water, or a hollow that seemed sheltered. Come nightfall, they'd discover their perfect spot was actually a wind tunnel that funneled icy air directly into their bedrolls, or worse, a low-lying area that collected cold like a bowl. Experienced cowboys taught the hard-won lesson: cold air settles in valleys and flat areas. Wind follows predictable patterns. That beautiful spot by the creek, it's going to be 10 degrees colder than the slightly elevated ground 50 yards away. Veterans could read terrain like a book, spotting the difference between a death trap and a decent sleeping spot from horseback. Camp veterans also learned the fire placement game through trial and error. Beginners would either sleep so far from the fire they got no benefit, or so close they'd wake up with singed blankets and hair. Worse yet, they'd position themselves where shifting winds would blow smoke directly into their faces all night long. The sweet spot was roughly 8 to 10 feet from a well-built fire, positioned so prevailing winds carried smoke away from your bedroll. Old hands knew to build reflector walls with rocks or logs to bounce heat back toward their sleeping area. They learned to bank fires properly so coals would last until morning, providing steady heat without constant tending. But here's where the real education happened: through stories. Around those same campfires, seasoned cowboys shared their worst nights and biggest mistakes. These weren't just entertainment, they were survival manuals disguised as tall tales. Remember that blizzard in '79 when Jake Morrison tried to tough it out without proper gear? An old-timer might say. Found him the next morning, bedroll soaked through, shaking like a leaf in a tornado. Doc said another hour, and we'd have been digging a grave instead of warming him up. These stories carried weight because everyone knew they were true. Cowboys had seen friends suffer frostbite, hypothermia, and worse. They'd watched strong men reduced to helpless, shivering wrecks by a single night of poor planning. The learning curve was steep because nature didn't offer second chances. Make the wrong choice about where to sleep, what to wear, or how to arrange your bedroll, and you might not wake up to correct it. This harsh reality created a culture where knowledge flowed freely from experienced hands to newcomers. Veterans taught greenhorns to test their gear before heading out on long drives. They showed them how to layer blankets for maximum warmth, how to waterproof their bedrolls, and how to recognize signs of dangerous weather. Most importantly, they taught them that there was no shame in asking for help or advice. The cowboys who survived and thrived were the ones who swallowed their pride and learned from others' mistakes, rather than insisting on making every error themselves. They understood that survival wasn't about being tough, it was about being smart. But learning from mistakes wasn't just about individual survival. Cowboys also discovered that their success was deeply connected to the animals they depended on. Keeping cattle and horses healthy during brutal weather became another crucial skill that could make or break a trail drive. When cowboys were trying not to freeze their boots off during those brutal frontier nights, they quickly learned something pretty important. Their survival wasn't just about staying warm themselves. It was tied directly to keeping their cattle and horses alive too. The animals weren't just cargo or transportation. They were walking heaters, windbreaks, and sometimes the difference between waking up in the morning or becoming a prairie popsicle. Smart cowboys figured out that when you bedded down a herd of cattle close together, you created what was basically a giant breathing furnace. Hundreds of animals packed into a tight space generated serious heat. The trick was positioning your bedroll downwind from the herd, close enough to catch that warmth but far enough away to avoid getting trampled if something spooked them in the middle of the night. Makes sense, right? But here's where it gets really clever. Cowboys would actually sleep right next to their horses when the temperature dropped dangerously low. A horse puts out about as much heat as a small campfire, and unlike a fire, it doesn't go out when you fall asleep. Some cowboys would tie their horse close to their bedroll and use the animal as a natural windbreak. The horse's body blocked those brutal prairie winds that could cut right through canvas and wool like they weren't even there. Then there's the saddle situation that most people never think about. Cowboys didn't just toss their saddles aside when they made camp. Smart trail hands would cover their saddles with blankets during freezing weather to keep the leather from getting stiff as a board. Frost-covered tack wasn't just uncomfortable, it could crack, break, or become impossible to use. A busted saddle on a cattle drive was almost as dangerous as a broken leg. Well, the really experienced cowboys took this animal partnership even further. They'd check on the cattle constantly during those bone-chilling nights, not just because the animals might wander off, but because moving around the herd kept their own blood flowing. Standing guard duty meant staying awake and active, which prevented hypothermia better than lying still in a bedroll. Plus, the cattle were like an early warning system for bad weather. When the herd started getting restless and bunching up tight, cowboys knew a serious cold snap or storm was coming. And the weird part is how some cowboys would actually share body heat with their horses in extreme situations. They'd wrap themselves and their horse's neck in the same blanket, creating a two-species survival pod. Sounds crazy, but when you're facing temperatures that could kill you, pride doesn't keep you warm. Horses didn't seem to mind much either. They were just as cold as the humans. Let's not forget that cattle drives had their own rhythm when it came to cold weather management. During the day, cowboys would ride alongside the herd, but at night they'd position the animals in sheltered spots whenever possible. A draw, a grove of trees, or even the lee side of a hill could trap warmer air and protect both cattle and cowboys from the worst of the wind. The animals instinctively knew how to huddle for warmth, and smart cowboys learned from watching them. But why did this animal-human cooperation work so well? Simple physics, really. Large animals generate heat through digestion and muscle movement, and that heat has to go somewhere. Cowboys who positioned themselves strategically could capture some of that thermal energy without interfering with the animal's natural behavior. It was like having a renewable heat source that didn't require wood, matches, or constant attention. The most successful trail bosses actually planned their routes around this knowledge. They'd map out stopping points where natural shelter was available for both the herd and the crew. Places where animals could bed down comfortably meant the cowboys could set up their bedrolls nearby and benefit from that collective warmth. It wasn't just about moving cattle from point A to point B, it was about creating a mobile survival system that kept everyone alive. Some old-timers tell stories about nights so cold that ice formed on the cattle's breath, but the animals kept generating heat all night long. Cowboys who learned to work with this natural heating system instead of fighting against the elements had much better survival rates. They understood that on the frontier, humans and animals were partners in staying alive, not just master and beast. What's really interesting is how this relationship shaped cowboy culture itself. The bond between a cowboy and his horse wasn't just sentimental, it was literally a matter of life and death during those freezing nights. That practical partnership created the deep respect for animals that became part of the cowboy code. Of course, keeping animals healthy in brutal weather required its own set of skills and knowledge. Cowboys had to understand animal behavior, recognize signs of distress, and know how to provide emergency care when frostbite or exposure threatened their four-legged lifelines. These survival partnerships worked both ways, and tomorrow we'll discover how some of the toughest people on the frontier weren't cowboys at all. The Old West wasn't exactly known for gender equality, but that didn't stop some tough-as-nails women from hitting the trail. These female cowhands faced the same brutal nights, the same freezing temperatures, and the same life-or-death choices about staying warm. The difference? They often had to be twice as clever, and 3 times as prepared. Most women on cattle drives weren't there by accident. They'd grown up on ranches, knew horses better than most men, and could rope a steer with the best of them. But when night fell and temperatures dropped, they faced unique challenges that their male counterparts rarely had to consider. The basic gear stayed the same. Heavy canvas bedrolls, wool blankets, and ground cloths were essential no matter what gender you were. However, women often modified their setups in smart ways. Many carried an extra quilt or two, sometimes handmade family heirlooms that served double duty as warmth and comfort from home. These weren't just sentimental additions, they were practical survival tools that could mean the difference between a miserable night and a decent rest. Then there's the clothing situation, which gets interesting fast. Women couldn't exactly strip down to long underwear around a campfire full of cowboys. They had to stay warm while maintaining some level of modesty, which meant getting creative with layering strategies. Many wore split riding skirts that could double as extra blankets, along with multiple petticoats that trapped warm air like insulation. Smart, right? The really clever ones learned to use their hair as an extra warming tool. Long hair could be braided and wrapped around the neck like a natural scarf, or spread across the shoulders inside the bedroll for additional insulation. Male cowboys with their typically shorter hair missed out on this built-in heat source entirely. But here's where it gets tougher. Women often received less support from their trail mates. While male cowboys might share body heat by sleeping back-to-back during particularly brutal nights, women usually had to go it alone. This forced them to become masters of solo survival techniques that many men never had to develop. Some remarkable stories survive from those days. There's the tale of Sarah Martinez, who improvised a winter shelter using her bedroll, some fallen branches, and her horse's saddle blanket during a surprise Colorado blizzard. She not only survived 3 days of below-zero weather, but kept her horse alive too. Her makeshift lean-to design was so effective that other cowboys started copying it. Women also had to deal with different safety concerns. Sleeping apart from the main group for privacy reasons meant being more vulnerable to both wild animals and harsh weather. This pushed many to become incredibly resourceful with limited materials. They'd stuff their bedrolls with anything that could add warmth, extra clothes, newspapers if available, even dried grass or leaves when desperate. The weird part is how often women outperformed men when it came to cold weather preparation. Maybe it was because they couldn't rely on others for help, or maybe they just paid better attention to details. Either way, experienced female trail hands became legendary for their ability to stay comfortable in conditions that left grown men shivering. Take clothing maintenance for instance. All women were more likely to keep spare dry socks specifically for sleeping, change out of wet clothes before bedding down, and take care of their gear so it lasted longer. These small habits added up to significantly warmer nights and better overall health on long drives. Some women even developed unique warming techniques that became camp legends. One trick involved heating small stones in the fire, wrapping them in cloth scraps, and placing them strategically in the bedroll before climbing in. The stones would radiate heat for hours, turning a freezing bedroll into a cozy cocoon. They also got creative with food-based warming strategies. Women were more likely to save hot coffee or soup in a covered cup to sip throughout the night, maintaining internal warmth when external heat sources weren't available. This internal heating approach was something many male cowboys overlooked entirely. The isolation factor couldn't be ignored either. While men could gather around fires, share stories and boost morale together, women often had to maintain their own spirits during long cold nights. This mental toughness became just as important as physical preparation for surviving harsh conditions. Despite facing extra challenges, many women thrived on the trail. Their success came from combining traditional cowboy techniques with their own innovations, creating hybrid survival strategies that were often more effective than standard methods. The stories of these pioneering women reveal something important about cold weather survival. It's not just about having the right gear or being physically tough. Success comes from adaptability, creativity, and the determination to make whatever you have work better than it was designed to. Their techniques proved so effective that smart male cowboys started paying attention, quietly adopting some of the innovations these women had developed out of necessity. But while women were mastering these survival skills through trial and error, they were also learning from another unexpected source that would revolutionize how everyone approached sleeping warm on the trail. Cowboys weren't too proud to learn from the people who'd been surviving on the land for thousands of years. When they crossed paths with Native American tribes, smart cowboys paid attention. These weren't casual conversations over coffee. This was life or death knowledge being shared between people who understood what it meant to sleep under an unforgiving sky. Native tribes had perfected the art of staying warm without modern gear, long before the first cowboy ever rolled out a canvas bedroll. They knew tricks that could mean the difference between waking up refreshed or not waking up at all. Cowboys quickly realized that dismissing this wisdom was a luxury they couldn't afford when temperatures dropped below freezing. One of the most valuable lessons involved insulation using natural materials. Native Americans showed cowboys how to stuff their bedrolls with dried grass, pine needles, or even cattail fluff. Sounds simple, right? But this technique could add crucial warmth when extra blankets weren't available. The key was creating dead air space, nature's best insulator. Cowboys learned to gather armfuls of dry prairie grass before sunset, then layer it between their blankets, or stuff it around their bodies inside the bedroll. Then there was the positioning wisdom that came from generations of outdoor survival. Native people taught cowboys to never sleep directly next to water sources, even if it seemed convenient. Water creates cold air that settles in low areas, making nights significantly colder. Cowboys who ignored this advice often woke up with frost on their blankets, while their smarter companions stayed relatively comfortable just a few hundred yards away. Wind direction knowledge proved equally crucial. Native tribes understood how air moves across different landscapes at night, and they shared these insights with cowboys willing to listen. Sleeping on the leeward side of hills or rock formations could provide protection from bone-chilling winds that would otherwise cut right through even the best wool blankets. Cowboys learned to read the land like a book, understanding which spots would trap warm air and which would funnel cold drafts straight through their camps. The weird part is how many cowboys initially resisted this advice, thinking their canvas and wool setup was superior. But after a few nights of chattering teeth while nearby native camps stayed warm using local materials, most cowboys swallowed their pride pretty quickly. Survival has a way of making people humble. Native Americans also shared knowledge about using animal fat and natural materials for body protection. They showed cowboys how to apply bear grease or other animal fats to exposed skin before sleeping, creating a barrier against wind and cold. This wasn't just about comfort. It prevented frostbite on faces and hands during the coldest nights. Cowboys started keeping small containers of animal fat in their bedrolls specifically for this purpose. Let's not forget the fire management techniques that native tribes had perfected over centuries. They taught cowboys about building reflecting walls behind fires using rocks or logs, which doubled the heat directed towards sleeping areas. Some tribes showed cowboys how to dig shallow trenches for fires, which protected flames from wind while concentrating heat upward toward bedrolls. But the really clever trick involved using heated stones more effectively than most cowboys had been doing. Native Americans demonstrated the proper way to heat rocks in fires, wrap them in leather or cloth, and place them strategically in bedrolls for all-night warmth. They knew which types of stones held heat longest, and which ones might crack or explode when heated too quickly. Ground preparation became another area where native knowledge proved invaluable. Cowboys learned to scrape away snow and dig shallow depressions for their bedrolls, then line these spaces with pine boughs or dry grass. This created insulation from below while forming a slight windbreak. The technique kept cowboys warmer, even when they couldn't find natural shelter like rocks or trees. Native tribes also shared timing knowledge that cowboys hadn't considered. They explained how body heat cycles worked and when to add or remove layers during the night. This prevented the dangerous cycle of sweating and then getting chilled when moisture froze in bedding. Cowboys who learned these techniques slept more comfortably and woke up in better condition for the next day's work. Some of the most practical advice involved emergency situations. Native Americans taught cowboys how to use their horses' body heat more effectively during blizzards or extreme cold snaps. They showed techniques for creating emergency shelters, using saddle blankets and available brush when regular bedrolls weren't sufficient. The knowledge sharing went both directions sometimes. Cowboys introduced native tribes to canvas and wool blankets, while receiving lessons about natural insulation and positioning in return. These exchanges created survival techniques that neither group had developed independently. Weather prediction skills also transferred from native knowledge to cowboy practices. Tribes taught cowboys to read cloud formations, wind changes, and animal behavior to anticipate dangerous cold snaps before they hit. This advance warning allowed cowboys to find better shelter or prepare extra insulation before temperatures plummeted. These survival lessons didn't just help individual cowboys, they spread throughout the entire trail culture as men shared techniques they'd learned from native encounters. The knowledge became part of standard cowboy wisdom, passed down to new hands without many even realizing where the techniques originated. Of course, not every interaction was friendly or educational, but when survival was on the line, practical knowledge often transcended other tensions. Cold weather was an equal opportunity threat that didn't care about cultural differences. Speaking of adapting techniques to different situations, cowboys soon discovered that survival methods needed to change dramatically depending on where they found themselves sleeping. Cowboys weren't just dealing with one type of cold. The American frontier threw every kind of weather challenge imaginable at these men, and surviving meant becoming a master of adaptation. A cowboy who learned to sleep warm in the Rocky Mountains might freeze his tail off in the Texas Panhandle if he didn't adjust his approach. High-altitude camping hit different than anything else. Up in the mountains, the air got thin, and the cold cut right through you like a knife. Cowboys driving cattle through mountain passes learned fast that their regular two-blanket setup wouldn't cut it at 8,000 feet. The smart ones packed extra wool blankets specifically for elevation. Others stuffed their bedrolls with pine needles or dry grass they found along the trail. Pine needles worked surprisingly well. They trapped air like nature's own insulation and smelled a whole lot better than sleeping next to sweaty socks. But here's where it gets tricky. What worked in Colorado could kill you in Montana. Northern plains brought a different beast entirely, wind that never stopped howling. Cowboys up there learned to dig sleeping holes in the dirt, just deep enough to get below the worst of that prairie wind. Some called them cowboy graves as a joke, though nobody was laughing when the temperature dropped to 20 below. Then there's the desert cold that caught greenhorns completely off guard. Most folks think deserts stay warm, but desert nights could drop 40 degrees from the daytime high. Cowboys learned to sleep in washes and arroyos where the earth held on to some heat from the day. The experienced hands knew to feel the ground with their hands before laying out their bedrolls. Rocky spots stayed warmer, longer than sandy areas. Seasonal changes meant constantly tweaking their gear setup. Spring cattle drives started warm but could turn deadly when late snowstorms hit. Smart cowboys kept their heavy winter blankets packed even into May. Fall drives were the worst for unpredictable weather. You might start in shirt sleeves and wake up with ice in your coffee cup. Geographic knowledge became as important as any other trail skill. Cowboys who worked the same routes year after year developed mental maps of every sheltered spot, every grove of trees, every rock formation that blocked wind. They'd plan their camps around these natural havens, sometimes pushing the herd an extra mile just to reach a spot they knew would keep them alive through the night. Let's not forget that weather could change faster than a rattlesnake strike. A clear evening could turn into a blizzard by midnight. The veterans carried what they called a weather eye, the ability to read cloud formations, wind shifts, and animal behavior to predict trouble coming. When the old-timers started adding extra layers to their bedrolls in the afternoon, everyone else followed suit. Falls, rivers, and streams created their own climate challenges. Sleeping near water meant dealing with extra humidity that could soak through canvas and turn wool blankets into cold, wet messes. But water also meant the air stayed a few degrees warmer on the coldest nights. Cowboys had to balance the risk of dampness against the benefit of slightly warmer air temperatures. Altitude sickness added another wrinkle to mountain sleeping. Cowboys who couldn't catch their breath during the day had even more trouble staying warm at night. Their bodies worked overtime just to get enough oxygen, leaving less energy for generating heat. The smart ones descended a few hundred feet from the main camp when possible, even if it meant a longer walk to tend the cattle. Some regions had their own local tricks that saved lives. Cowboys working near Native American territories often learned region-specific techniques. In the Southwest, they discovered that certain types of sagebrush made excellent insulation when stuffed between blankets. Up north, they learned about building snow walls as windbreaks. Counterintuitive, but effective. Weather patterns varied wildly even within the same region. A valley that stayed comfortable one night might turn into a frost pocket the next, depending on wind direction and cloud cover. Cowboys developed an almost supernatural ability to read the land and predict which campsites would stay warmest. The weird part is how quickly a cowboy had to adapt when switching between different types of terrain. A man might spend 2 weeks sleeping warm in a river valley, then climb into mountain country where his tried-and-true methods suddenly didn't work. Flexibility meant survival. Stubborn cowboys who refused to change their approach often found themselves shivering through miserable nights. Equipment had to work across multiple climates too. A bedroll setup that handled mountain snow needed to also manage desert wind and prairie storms. This meant cowboys couldn't specialize their gear too much for any one environment. They needed systems that worked everywhere, even if they weren't perfect anywhere. But even the most adaptable cowboys knew their limits. Some men thrived in mountain cold, but couldn't handle the bone-deep chill of prairie winters. Others loved the desert, but struggled with high-altitude thin air. Knowing your strengths and weaknesses could determine which cattle drives you signed up for, and whether you'd make it home alive. All this climate knowledge would prove crucial when unexpected dangers struck during the worst possible weather conditions. The Old West is long gone, but those cowboy sleeping tricks, they're alive and kicking in the modern camping world. Walk into any outdoor gear store today, and you'll spot something familiar: wool blankets, canvas tarps, and yes, even cowboy bedrolls marketed to weekend adventurers who want a taste of that rugged life. Here's what's wild: the basic science behind staying warm hasn't changed one bit. Cowboys figured out layering, wind protection, and ground insulation without fancy degrees or laboratory testing. They just had cold nights and smart minds. Modern campers are essentially rediscovering what trail hands knew 150 years ago. Wool works, canvas blocks wind, and sleeping directly on the ground will suck the heat right out of you. But today's cowboy camping isn't quite the same beast. For starters, modern minimalist campers choose to sleep under the stars. Cowboys, they slept rough because they had to. Big difference there. When you know there's a warm hotel an hour's drive away, roughing it becomes an adventure instead of survival. The gear has gotten some serious upgrades though. Modern wool blankets are often treated to resist moths and shrinkage. Canvas comes pre-waterproofed instead of requiring cowboys to rub animal fat or beeswax into every inch. Ground cloths now include reflective materials that bounce body heat back up. Makes sense, right? Then there's the synthetic revolution. Modern sleeping bags stuffed down to the size of a loaf of bread and weigh less than a single wool blanket. Synthetic insulation works even when soaking wet. Something that would have blown a cowboy's mind. Imagine telling a trail hand that future campers would carry sleeping systems warmer than 3 wool blankets, but lighter than his boots. Well, not everyone's buying into the high-tech approach. Survivalists and bushcraft enthusiasts actively study original cowboy techniques as essential skills. They practice rolling traditional bedrolls, building lean-tos from natural materials, and heating stones for warmth. All these folks argue that batteries die and zippers break, but wool and canvas just keep working. The military picked up on cowboy methods too. Modern soldiers use modified bedroll systems for quick deployment camping. The idea of rolling everything into one portable bundle that protects gear while providing shelter, that's pure cowboy innovation adapted for contemporary warfare. Outdoor gear companies have noticed this trend. Berry sells heritage camping equipment. Pendleton markets wool camp blankets with cowboy-style designs. Filson makes canvas bedroll bags that look like they stepped out of 1880. The marketing practically writes itself. Sleep like the legends did. But the weird part is how much we've complicated something cowboys kept simple. Modern camping stores stock hundreds of sleeping pad options, temperature-rated bags, and shelter systems. Cowboys had canvas, wool, and common sense. They didn't stress about R values or fill power ratings. Cold night, add another blanket. Still cold, move closer to the fire. Minimalist camping has embraced this philosophy. The ultralight movement strips away everything non-essential. Just like cowboys traveling hundreds of miles with limited pack space, some modern hikers carry sleeping systems that weigh less than 2 pounds total. Cowboys would have killed for gear that light and warm. Let's not forget the social aspect that modern campers try to recreate. Group camping trips often feature campfires, shared stories and communal cooking, the same elements that helped cowboys survive harsh nights. The difference? Today's campers Instagram their s'mores instead of sharing beans and hardtack. Weather apps have replaced cowboy weather sense though. Modern campers check hourly forecasts and radar maps. Cowboys read cloud formations, wind direction, and animal behavior. They couldn't afford to get caught off guard by sudden storms. Their weather prediction skills were literally life or death accurate. The ground game has changed completely. Cowboys slept wherever darkness found them, rocky ground, muddy creek beds, or prickly desert. Modern campers research campsites, check reviews, and expect level tent pads. Some even refuse to camp without bathroom facilities nearby. Cowboys would laugh themselves silly at that requirement. Yet certain challenges remain identical. Staying dry still matters just as much. Wind protection is still crucial for warmth. Ground insulation prevents heat loss exactly like it did in 1875. Fire safety requires the same careful attention. The fundamentals haven't budged an inch. Modern cowboy camping misses one key element though. The stakes were different. Today's campers uncomfortable, they pack up and head home. Cowboys cold and miserable, they endured until the job finished or spring arrived. That mental toughness can't be bought at any outdoor store. The techniques that kept cowboys alive in brutal conditions now help weekend warriors enjoy nature more comfortably. Not a bad legacy for men who just wanted to avoid freezing to death on the job. But how exactly did these methods prove their worth when survival wasn't just camping practice, but a matter of life and death mathematics? When you're sleeping on frozen ground with nothing but wool and canvas between you and death, numbers become more than statistics. They become survival guides. The data from cattle drives and frontier life tells a fascinating story about who lived, who died, and what actually worked when the temperature dropped. Most cowboys hitting the trail weren't grizzled old-timers like the movies suggest. Surveys from major cattle drives show the average age hovered between 16 and 25 years old. These were young men barely out of boyhood, facing conditions that would challenge seasoned outdoorsmen today. Their youth worked both for and against them during those brutal nights. Young bodies generated more heat and recovered faster from cold exposure, but inexperience killed. Green cowboys made deadly mistakes their first winter on the trail, forgetting to check their bedrolls for tears, sleeping in low spots where cold air pooled, or failing to keep spare socks dry. The learning curve was steep, and mistakes had consequences. Freezing deaths during cattle drives were surprisingly rare in official records, but that doesn't tell the whole story. Many cowboys who got frostbite or suffered hypothermia simply disappeared from the trail. They either died quietly and were buried along the route, or they abandoned cowboy life before it killed them. The ones who survived long enough to be counted were the smart ones, the lucky ones, or both. Temperature measurements from that era weren't precise, but cowboys developed their own survival math. A quality wool blanket could mean the difference between sleeping comfortably and shivering all night. Tests with period-accurate bedding show wool blankets added roughly 10 degrees of warmth compared to sleeping without them. That might not sound like much, but when you're dealing with temperatures in the 20s, 10 degrees separates misery from comfort. Multiple wool layers created exponentially better results. 2 blankets didn't just double the warmth, they created dead air space that tripled the insulation effect. Cowboys who invested in 3 or 4 wool blankets rarely complained about cold nights, assuming they stayed dry. Fire management statistics reveal another crucial survival factor. Cowboys who maintained fires through the night reduced their risk of cold-related problems by about 30%. But here's the catch. Keeping a fire burning all night required teamwork and planning. Someone had to gather enough wood before dark, arrange it properly, and take shifts feeding the flames. The math was brutal but simple. A poorly tended fire died around 2 in the morning, exactly when temperatures hit their lowest point. That left 4 to 6 hours of bone-chilling cold before sunrise. Good fire management meant survival. Poor fire management meant suffering, and sometimes worse. Ground temperature data shows another interesting pattern. The earth beneath a cowboy could be 15 to 20 degrees colder than the air temperature. Without proper ground insulation, a man could freeze from below even with decent blankets above. Cowboys who used thick ground cloths or piled brush beneath their bedrolls reported significantly warmer nights. Wind speed made everything worse in predictable ways. A 10-mile-per-hour breeze could drop the effective temperature by another 10 degrees. 20-mile-per-hour winds created conditions that overwhelmed most bedding systems entirely. Smart cowboys learned to read weather signs and find shelter before the wind picked up. Success rates varied dramatically by region and season. Spring and fall drives had the highest completion rates, while winter drives saw 30 to 40% more cowboys quitting or getting injured. Mountain routes above 4,000 feet created the toughest conditions, with some drives losing half their crew to weather-related problems. Then there's the surprising data about alcohol consumption. Despite the Hollywood image of cowboys drinking whiskey to stay warm, records show excessive drinking actually increased cold weather injuries. Alcohol made men feel warmer while actually lowering their core body temperature. The cowboys who survived the longest winters were often the ones who stayed relatively sober. Equipment failure rates tell their own story. Canvas bedrolls lasted an average of 2 to 3 seasons with proper care. Wool blankets could last decades if protected from moths and kept reasonably clean. But a single night of heavy rain could destroy cotton bedding permanently, leaving a cowboy vulnerable for the rest of the drive. Quick thinking versus preparation created interesting survival patterns. Cowboys who spent time each evening checking their gear, gathering firewood, and choosing good sleeping spots had much higher survival rates than those who relied on quick reflexes when problems arose. Preparation beat improvisation almost every time. The most telling statistic involves career length. Cowboys who mastered cold weather sleeping techniques averaged 5 to 7 years on the trail. Those who never learned proper methods rarely lasted more than 2 winters. The gear mattered, but knowledge mattered more. These numbers paint a clear picture of frontier survival, but they also reveal something else. While statistics help us understand what worked for cowboys, the real question becomes how much of their hard-won wisdom actually translated to the stories we tell today. Hollywood got cowboys wrong in almost every way imaginable. Those classic Western movies you grew up watching, they're basically fantasy when it comes to how cowboys actually stayed warm at night. John Wayne never once worried about hypothermia in Red River, did he? Most films show cowboys sleeping under nothing more than a thin blanket, looking perfectly comfortable on bare ground. The reality was completely different. Real cowboys were bundled up like Arctic explorers, wearing multiple layers of wool and wrapped in heavy canvas bedrolls that weighed 30 pounds or more. But that doesn't look very heroic on screen, does it? The movie cowboys seem to wake up fresh and ready for action after sleeping on rocks with just their saddle as a pillow. Meanwhile, actual cowboys spent half their morning routine working out the kinks from sleeping on frozen ground. Even with all their gear, they'd hobble around the campfire like old men until their joints warmed up. Not exactly the image Hollywood wanted to sell. Then there's the clothing situation. Movie cowboys wear those perfectly clean shirts and vests, never adding extra layers when the sun goes down. Real cowboys slept in everything they owned when temperatures dropped. Long underwear, multiple shirts, wool socks, hats, and sometimes even their boots. They looked more like stuffed scarecrows than romantic heroes. Weather in Western movies is either blazing hot desert sun or dramatic thunderstorms for plot purposes. Rarely do you see the bone-chilling cold that plagued most cattle drives. Snow scenes are usually brief and beautiful, not the weeks-long battles against freezing temperatures that cowboys actually faced. The movies skip right over those miserable nights, when men questioned every life choice that led them to sleeping outdoors in February. Fire scenes in movies are particularly ridiculous. Cowboys sit around these perfectly contained campfires, chatting casually while the flames stay exactly the same size all night long. Real cowboys were constantly feeding those fires, taking shifts to keep them burning, and positioning their bedrolls precisely to catch the heat without catching sparks. It was work, not a social hour. The bedroll itself gets butchered by Hollywood. Movie bedrolls unfurl like magic carpets, instantly creating a comfortable sleeping surface. Actual cowboy bedrolls were complex systems that took time to set up properly. The canvas had to be positioned just right to block wind. The blankets needed layering in specific orders. The ground cloth required careful placement to avoid moisture seepage. Most Western movies never show the morning routine either. Cowboys don't just hop up and start riding. They had to dig frozen boots out of their bedrolls, shake frost off their blankets, and spend precious time warming up by whatever was left of the fire. Some mornings, everything was so frozen that bedrolls had to be thawed before they could be rolled up. The tough guy image gets completely twisted in movies too. Film cowboys prove their toughness by enduring hardship without complaint or preparation. Real cowboys proved their toughness by being smart enough to prepare for harsh conditions. Suffering needlessly wasn't admirable. It was stupid and potentially deadly. Movie cowboys also sleep alone, spread out romantically under the stars. Actual cowboys often slept close together for shared body heat. Partners would position their bedrolls back to back or side by side, especially during cold snaps. It wasn't about friendship or romance, it was about not dying of exposure. Weather changes in films happen dramatically, and usually serve the plot. Rain starts right when tension peaks. Snow begins falling during emotional scenes. Real weather didn't care about storytelling. Cowboys might wake up to 6 inches of unexpected snow on a morning that started clear, or face 3 days of freezing drizzle that soaked through every layer of protection they had. The geographic reality gets ignored too. Movie cowboys travel from desert to mountain to prairie without changing their gear or sleeping methods. Real cowboys adjusted their setups constantly based on altitude, humidity, wind patterns, and seasonal changes. What worked in Texas wouldn't work in Montana, and experienced hands knew the difference. Perhaps the biggest myth is that cowboys enjoyed sleeping outdoors. Movies romanticize it as freedom and adventure under endless starry skies. Most real cowboys would have gladly traded those stars for a warm bunkhouse and a real mattress. They did it because the job required it, not because they loved communing with nature. The silence in movie camp scenes is laughable too. Film cowboys drift off to sleep in perfect quiet, maybe with some gentle wind sounds. Real camps were full of noise, snoring, coughing, shifting positions, getting up to tend the fire, checking on horses, and dealing with various bodily functions. Sleep was often interrupted and rarely peaceful. But here's what's really interesting about these Hollywood myths. They actually made the cowboy lifestyle seem easier than it was, not harder. The real techniques cowboys developed were far more clever and sophisticated than anything shown in movies. Which raises the question, why did cowboys themselves become so legendary for being tough when they were actually just really smart about survival? Cowboys weren't just tough because they could rope a steer or break a wild horse. The real test of cowboy grit came when the sun went down and temperatures dropped to bone-chilling levels. Surviving night after night in brutal cold, with nothing but a bedroll and some wool blankets, that's what separated the real cowboys from the wannabes. The tough guy reputation wasn't some Hollywood invention either. These men genuinely earned it by enduring conditions that would send most people running for the nearest hotel. We're talking about sleeping on frozen ground when it's 20 degrees below zero, with nothing overhead but stars and storm clouds. Makes your worst camping experience look like a luxury vacation, right? But here's the thing about cowboy bragging, it was part survival strategy, part peer pressure. Cowboys would sit around the campfire telling stories about the coldest night they'd ever survived. Each tale got a little more dramatic with every telling. Why, I remember a night so cold my coffee froze before I could drink it, one might say. Another would counter with, that's nothing. Last winter I woke up with icicles hanging from my mustache. These weren't just tall tales though. Cowboys genuinely competed to see who could tough out the worst conditions. It became a badge of honor to sleep through a blizzard without complaining. The guys who whined about the cold, or asked for extra blankets, they got labeled as soft pretty quick. Nobody wanted that reputation on a cattle drive where respect meant everything. Then there's the reality behind all that bragging. Many cowboys were barely out of their teens, full of pride and desperate to prove themselves to older, more experienced hands. They'd rather freeze half to death than admit they couldn't handle the cold. Peer pressure worked both ways too. Veteran cowboys would test newcomers by giving them the worst sleeping spots or forgetting to share campfire tricks. What's fascinating is how this toughness became legend. Stories of cowboys sleeping through killer blizzards spread from camp to camp, ranch to ranch. Eventually these tales made their way into dime novels, and later into movies. The image of the stoic cowboy, unfazed by any hardship, became deeply embedded in American culture. Cowboys developed their own language around cold weather survival too. They'd talk about hard nights when the temperature dropped dangerously low. A soft night meant relatively comfortable sleeping weather, maybe only down to freezing. Teeth-chattering cold was exactly what it sounds like, while a killer cold meant temperatures that could literally end your life if you weren't careful. The weird part is how many cowboys actually enjoyed the challenge. After surviving their first brutal winter on the trail, some men felt almost invincible. They'd seek out the toughest jobs, the longest drives, the worst weather conditions. It was like an addiction to proving their toughness over and over again. Let's not forget the economic reality behind all this bravado. Cowboys who couldn't handle cold weather didn't last long in the profession. Trail bosses had no patience for men who couldn't function after a freezing night. If you couldn't stay warm enough to do your job the next day, you'd find yourself out of work pretty fast. Toughness wasn't just about pride, it was about survival and keeping steady employment. But the truth is, many cowboys eventually reached their breaking point. After a few brutal winters, even the toughest men would start looking for easier work. Maybe a job closer to town, or in a warmer climate, or anything that didn't involve sleeping on frozen ground for months at a time. The smart ones saved their money and bought small ranches where they could sleep in actual beds. Some cowboys developed what we might call cold weather PTSD today. They'd have nightmares about freezing to death, or wake up in panic even when sleeping in warm bunkhouses. Others developed permanent health problems, chronic cough, joint pain, or circulation issues from too many nights in brutal conditions. The really successful cowboys were the ones who balanced toughness with intelligence. They could endure the cold when necessary, but they also knew every trick for staying warm. They invested in quality bedrolls, learned to read weather signs, and picked the best camping spots. They were tough enough to handle whatever came their way, but smart enough not to suffer unnecessarily. This reputation for toughness extended beyond just sleeping in the cold. Cowboys who could handle brutal nights were assumed to be reliable in other dangerous situations too. Ranch owners preferred hiring men who'd proven they could survive anything Mother Nature threw at them. The legend grew bigger than the reality, but the reality was impressive enough. These men regularly endured conditions that would hospitalize people today. They did it with primitive gear and sheer determination. While the gear and techniques evolved over time, the fundamental challenge remained constant until the very end of the open range era. The golden age of cowboy bedrolls was already fading by the 1880s. While trail hands were still perfecting their canvas and wool survival systems, the world around them was changing fast. Railroad lines stretched across the continent like steel spiders, connecting remote territories to civilization. Towns sprouted up along these tracks faster than prairie grass after spring rain. What did this mean for the freezing cowboy wrapped in his trusty bedroll? Well, it meant he had options his predecessors could only dream of. Instead of spending every night under the stars with nothing but canvas between him and a blizzard, cowboys could now plan routes that included actual beds. Hotels began appearing in railroad towns, offering warm rooms for a few coins. Sure, they weren't luxury accommodations, but compared to sleeping on frozen ground, even a lumpy mattress felt like paradise. The old-timers weren't too thrilled about these changes. They'd earned their reputation surviving brutal nights with nothing but wool blankets and grit. Younger cowboys, however, jumped at the chance to sleep indoors whenever possible. Can you blame them? Once you've experienced frostbite, a heated room becomes pretty appealing. Railroad expansion also meant cattle drives themselves were changing. Instead of pushing herds hundreds of miles to distant markets, ranchers could drive cattle to the nearest rail depot. Shorter drives meant fewer nights sleeping rough. The month-long expeditions that had tested every cowboy's cold weather survival skills were becoming less common. Then there's the gear evolution that followed. As technology improved, so did sleeping equipment. The heavy canvas bedrolls that had served cowboys for decades started competing with newer inventions. Sleeping bags with better insulation appeared in general stores. These weren't quite the high-tech versions we know today, but they offered improvements over traditional bedrolls. Some cowboys embraced these innovations, while others stuck to what they knew worked. The debate around campfires probably got heated, no pun intended. Old hands would swear by their time-tested wool and canvas combinations, while newcomers experimented with factory-made sleeping gear. Both sides had valid points, but progress rarely asks permission. Military surplus also flooded the market after various conflicts. Army blankets and tents became available to civilians, giving cowboys access to gear designed for soldiers facing similar outdoor challenges. These military items were often better manufactured than what cowboys could cobble together themselves, though they lacked the personal touch of a hand-assembled bedroll. The rise of permanent ranching operations changed things too. Instead of following cattle across open range, more cowboys found steady work on established spreads. These ranchers invested in bunkhouses, barns and other structures that provided shelter. Cowboys still needed their bedrolls for occasional overnight trips, but the days of sleeping outdoors for months at a time were numbered. Weather prediction also improved during this era. Telegraph lines allowed weather information to travel faster than storms themselves. Cowboys could receive warnings about incoming blizzards or cold snaps, giving them time to seek shelter or prepare better. This advance notice probably prevented countless cases of frostbite and hypothermia. But here's the weird part. Some cowboys actually missed the old challenges. The hardships that had nearly killed them also defined who they were. Surviving a brutal winter night in nothing but a bedroll was a badge of honor. As creature comforts became available, part of the cowboy mystique began disappearing. Manufacturing improvements meant better materials too. Canvas became more waterproof and durable. Wool blankets were woven tighter and warmer. Even simple things like buttons, buckles, and rope improved in quality. Cowboys assembling bedrolls in the 1890s had access to superior components compared to their 1860s counterparts. The famous cattle towns like Dodge City and Abilene peaked during this transition period. These destinations offered cowboys their first taste of indoor accommodations after long drives. Many trail hands would spend their entire earnings on a few nights of warm beds, hot baths, and solid roofs. The contrast between sleeping in luxury and returning to bedrolls must have been jarring. Photography from this era shows the evolution happening in real time. Early pictures show cowboys with basic bedrolls and minimal gear. Later photos reveal more sophisticated equipment, better built wagons, and improved camp setups. The technology gap between decades becomes obvious when you compare these images. Native American influences continued during this period, but started fading as tribes were relocated to reservations. The knowledge sharing that had helped cowboys survive extreme weather became less common. Traditional survival wisdom was being replaced by manufactured solutions. Regional differences became more pronounced too. Cowboys in northern territories still faced brutal winters that demanded serious cold weather skills. Southern ranch hands might go entire careers without experiencing life-threatening cold. The universal need for bedroll mastery was disappearing. As the 1800s wound down, the classic cowboy lifestyle was transforming into something entirely different. The skills that had kept generations of trail hands from freezing were becoming historical footnotes rather than daily necessities. These changes set the stage for what cowboys could teach future generations about survival and adaptation. The Old West taught us something that modern society sometimes forgets. Survival isn't about having the latest gear. It's about understanding the basics and making them work, no matter what Mother Nature throws at you. Cowboys didn't have REI catalogs or Amazon Prime delivery to their campsites. They made do with wool, canvas, and common sense, and guess what? Their methods still work today. Those same principles that kept trail hands alive on freezing nights in 1880 can save your bacon on a camping trip right now. Ground insulation matters more than most people realize. Cowboys knew this instinctively. They never slept directly on cold earth. Modern campers who skip the sleeping pad and wonder why they're shivering at 3 a.m. could learn from this. The ground sucks heat from your body faster than you'd believe. A simple barrier makes all the difference. Layering wasn't just fashion advice back then. It was life insurance. Cowboys understood that trapping air between layers created warmth, and removing or adding pieces let them adjust to changing temperatures. This same strategy works whether you're backpacking in Colorado or car camping at the local state park. Then there's the wool factor. Synthetic materials have their place, but wool's ability to insulate when wet remains unmatched. Cowboys figured this out through trial and error, sometimes deadly error. Modern outdoor enthusiasts spend hundreds on high-tech fabrics that can't match what sheep naturally produce. Fire management skills from the cowboy era translate directly to today's camping world. Those trail hands knew exactly how to position themselves relative to a campfire for maximum warmth without setting their bedrolls ablaze. They understood wind patterns, heat reflection, and fuel conservation in ways that would impress modern survivalists. But here's where it gets interesting. Cowboys were natural meteorologists. They read clouds, felt barometric pressure changes, and positioned their camps accordingly. No weather apps needed. Learning to read natural signs can prevent a miserable night outdoors, whether you're on a cattle drive or a weekend getaway. The teamwork aspect often gets overlooked when people romanticize the lone cowboy image. These guys survived by watching out for each other. Hypothermia doesn't announce itself. It sneaks up quietly. Having someone check on you during brutal conditions could mean the difference between waking up and not waking up at all. Cowboys also understood that staying warm started long before bedtime. Hot meals, dry clothes, proper hydration, all these factors contributed to surviving cold nights. They didn't wait until they were already freezing to start thinking about warmth. Prevention beat treatment every time. The psychological component mattered too. Maintaining morale during harsh conditions wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival. Cowboys who gave up mentally often gave up physically. Modern research confirms what those trail hands knew: your mental state directly affects your body's ability to generate and retain heat. Let's not forget the practical lessons about gear care. Cowboys treated their bedrolls like their lives depended on them, because they did. They waterproofed canvas, aired out blankets, and repaired tears immediately. Neglecting gear maintenance could be fatal. Modern campers who stuff wet sleeping bags into storage or ignore small rips are playing the same dangerous game. Adaptability was perhaps the cowboys' greatest strength. No two nights were exactly alike on the trail. Weather changed, terrain varied, and supplies dwindled. The ability to improvise solutions using available materials separated survivors from casualties. This flexibility remains crucial for anyone spending time outdoors. Resource conservation became second nature. Fuel for fires was often scarce. Extra blankets were heavy luxuries. Cowboys learned to maximize warmth while minimizing weight and waste. Modern ultralight backpackers are rediscovering these same principles of efficiency. The Old West also taught respect for nature's power. Cowboys didn't try to conquer the elements, they learned to work with them. Finding natural windbreaks, choosing campsites wisely, and timing activities around weather patterns showed intelligence, not weakness. Fighting nature usually meant losing. And the weird part is how much of this knowledge got lost as civilization advanced. Indoor heating and modern conveniences made these skills seem obsolete. But every time someone goes camping, these lessons become relevant again. The principles don't change just because the calendar does. Emergency preparedness was built into cowboy culture. They always had backup plans for their backup plans. Extra dry socks, emergency food, multiple fire starting methods, redundancy saved lives on the frontier. Modern emergency preparedness experts teach the same concepts cowboys lived by daily. The legacy continues through outdoor education programs, military training, and survival courses. Those canvas bedrolls and wool blankets pioneered concepts that evolved into modern sleeping systems. The DNA of cowboy ingenuity runs through every piece of camping gear designed today. Cowboys proved that humans can adapt to almost any environment with the right knowledge and attitude. Their sleeping techniques weren't just about surviving the night. They were about thriving in challenging conditions while maintaining the strength to work hard the next day. These lessons from dusty trails and starlit skies remain as valuable today as they were 150 years ago.